Chapter 420. In Duque's plan, Alicia was not supposed to appear here. Alicia's early return to her family to meet Duke Barov was actually to pave the way for Duque to meet with the Duke. Duke Barov was a family supremacist. If he was called over by King Eden and faced the situation directly, it was obvious that whether it was out of his friendship with Eden or consideration for his family's business, Duque estimated that there was a 90% chance that he would agree to join the alliance. In history, the Barov family had also boarded Eden's pirate ship and suffered terribly from Eden. When Alterac failed to suck up to the tribe's daddy, Eden fled to the Barov family's hometown, Cair Darrow, and was surrounded by the alliance's troops. Duke Barov finally chose to hand Eden over. But after the war, the Barov family's territory was still confiscated, which led to the Barov family offering the entire Cair Darrow to the cursing sect during the Third Battle of the Dark Portal, causing the family's territory to become a scholomance where undead gathered. Since Duque knew about it, he would not let this tragedy happen. He easily convinced Duke Barov. It was simple. If even the Alliance's deputy commander Duque knew about the so-called betrayal of the Alliance, then the so-called rebellion was simply a joke. Since it was an anti-human plan that was destined to fail, even if it was the king he was loyal to, Duke Barov had no reason to board Eden's sinking ship. The reason for supporting the alliance was also very simple. I am a human first, then a subject loyal to the king. Just like that, Duque obtained the full support of Duke Barov and his wife, and was able to use illusions to pretend to be Duke Barov and participate in Eden's betrayal. In Duque's plan, there was no need for Alicia to appear. But now, Alicia appeared on the rooftop under the protection of 4 strong private soldiers wearing the Barov family emblem. Not only Alicia, but there were also 2 Alterac court mages standing behind her. Duque glanced at the red dragon and griffins fighting in the sky and said nervously, "Alicia, it's dangerous here. I only told you to gather people to help set up the magic array. I didn't ask you to come. But I want to help you. Duque, you want to wipe out the red dragon army, don't you?" A strong gust of wind blew past, causing Alicia's beautiful black hair to flutter in the wind. Beneath her silver forehead ornament was a pair of beautiful, intelligent eyes. Being with Alicia had always made Duque feel comfortable. She was considerate and submissive, just like a little wife who would meekly endure whatever hardship she encountered. Not only that, but she had a good upbringing and excellent diplomatic skills, and she was also quite smart. However, Duke did not expect Alicia to be this smart. Duque smiled, "As I expected. I've seen through you." Alicia raised her chin a little proudly. "Of course, what you wanted me to do was to set up a magic circle to enhance the power of ice and snow, and I immediately thought of it. So I asked my father to use his connections to give you a little surprise." The daughter of the Barov family turned around and introduced them to Duke. "These 2 are Alterac's court archmages Gasnerd and Chailt. They can give you control of the Alterac Palace's magic array." At this point, Alicia blinked. One of the magic circles in the Alterac Palace is flight restriction. Duque was stunned. To be honest, Duque was not sure if Orgrim would come. He just instinctively felt that Orgrim would not let go of the chance to control a human kingdom. That was why he borrowed the power of Duke Barov, who was in power with Alterac, to bring in half of the Silverhand Knights and the Windrunner sisters. The Silverhand only had about 100 elite paladins. Half of the knights only had 70 people, which was not a problem for Duke Barov. If Orgrim did not come, these people would be more than enough to suppress King Eden. If Orgrim came, the Horde would be in trouble. Since Orgrim liked to use dragoons as cover, Duque hoped to change the ratio of air forces between the 2 sides. The Griffin Knights of the Wildhammer Dwarves were strong, but they should be used in better ways than to fight the Red Dragons. So, Duque secretly asked Alicia to arrange a magic array at the top of the palace. But Duque only wanted to deal a heavy blow to the Red Dragon army, not wipe them out. He knew his own strength. It was too difficult to wipe out hundreds of red dragons with the power of a Morning Star wizard. Alicia had just told him that even Eden's most trusted court wizard was from the Barov family, and that he could control the magic array in the palace to set up a no-fly zone? Then there was hope. A wave of ecstasy welled up in Duque's heart. Duque was so excited that he could not control himself. He subconsciously hugged Alicia and patted her on the back. "Ah, that's great. That's great. I'll kill you lizards this time. Alicia, you've done a great job." At first, Alicia was dumbfounded. She had never thought that Duque would be so happy that he hugged her. The next moment, a faint blush appeared on her elegant face. She said lightly, "Ugh, as long as you're happy, Duque." "Of course I'm happy. Right, it's dangerous here. Go to a safe place quickly, I'm going to play big." With that, the simple-minded Duque threw her aside and went to discuss some matters with the two court wizards. Lucia pursed her lips, her small hands gripping the hem of her wizard robe tightly before letting go. Duque is a man who does big things. With that, she did not plan to pester Duque. After bidding farewell to Duque, she tactfully retreated. A few minutes after Duque sent a magical message, Kudrin, who was fighting in the sky, finally received Duque's message. "What? Are you kidding?" "Of course I'm not kidding. Please, you're playing with fire with the lives of all the Wildhammer Griffin Knights and Griffins in the Eagle Nest Mountain." Kudrin almost cursed out loud, losing speed and altitude in an aerial battle. "That's suicide. And falling from this height won't kill those lizards. Who told you that I want to fight a simple aerial battle? I don't agree. Unless you have a better reason to convince me." As he spoke, Kudrin controlled Scarlet to make a maneuver that was similar to Engerman's spin. While Scarlet was spinning, Kudrin used Stormhammer to send an orc flying into the air. "Alright, I've told you my trump card is..." Upon hearing that name, Kudrin's body trembled. "Alright, you've convinced me." Chapter 421. Compared to the one-sided battle in the palace, the battle in the sky had reached its climax. Apart from Kudrin's initial ambush that successfully killed a group of red dragons, the rest were all bloody battles. The sky was filled with Wildhammer Dwarf Griffin Knights and Red Dragon Knights. A few human Griffin Knights were only joining in the fray, surrounding and attacking the injured red dragons. Overall, it was still disadvantageous for the alliance. It was mainly due to the individual differences. Griffins were strong, but that was only in the eyes of humans and beastmen. When facing the red dragons, the Griffins were suppressed in almost every aspect: speed, strength, defense, and vitality. Only in terms of agility were the Griffins slightly superior. Kudrin had been trying to make up for his lack of combat power with tactics, such as sending one Griffin to lure the red dragons while the other two Griffins attacked from the back, killing the Dragon Roar orcs first before dealing with the red dragons. Unfortunately, the overall situation was still precarious. However, with good coordination and cover, the injured Griffins quickly retreated and managed to maintain the situation. Kudrin did not know how to win, and most of the Wildhammer dwarves were only relying on their vitality to support themselves. Originally, Kudrin was not optimistic about Duque's plan, but since Duque had invited that person, he decided to trust him for the time being. "Duque, you bastard. If you join the Wildhammer Griffin Legion and perish here today, I will find you and beat you to death even if you hide in the depths of hell. Don't worry. Stay calm," Duque said in a magical message. "Damn it, I must be crazy." While muttering to himself, Kudrin kept his storm warhammer and held the reins with one hand while blowing the horn with the other. Woo, woo, woo. The distant and heroic sound of the horn attracted the attention of all the Wildhammer dwarves. At this moment, the sun suddenly broke through the thick layers of clouds. As if responding to the call of the Wildhammer King, the white wings of countless griffins shone with golden radiance under the sunlight. They quickly got rid of their opponents and began to gather at the center of the battlefield. But every Wildhammer dwarf was dumbfounded. The next sound of the horn was landing. A short inquiry was sent to Kudrin. The reply was still land. The Wildhammer dwarves were dumbfounded. If they landed now, wouldn't their backs be exposed to the red dragon? And it was so dense. If the red dragon came over and used its dragon breath, that would really be... Oh. Even if our king wants to roast our griffin friends, there's no need to do that, right? The Wildhammer dwarves almost burst into tears. However, there was no other way. Sensing the gathering of the griffins, the red dragons had automatically ascended to a higher altitude. Then they all descended to a lower altitude and began diving down towards the griffins. "Descend. If you don't want to die, come down to the lawn of the palace." Kudrin ordered the herald beside him to repeatedly sound the horn, while he waved his arms fiercely, ordering his men to land. "Whatever. If I die, I die." The Wildhammer dwarves gnashed their teeth and cursed Kudrin. They cursed the ancestors of the bastard who came up with this idea and ordered the griffins to descend at high speed. Above their heads, the huge red dragon legion had also finished assembling. Nearly 300 dragons formed a terrifying dragon roar, forming a tsunami of sound that echoed in the clear sky. The dwarves turned their heads and saw the scene that covered the sky. As if they were under a spell, they were nailed to the backs of the griffins and could not move. Their eyes were filled with despair as they looked up at the sky. They were almost paralyzed. If it wasn't for the dwarves tying themselves to the back of the griffins to avoid being thrown down in the fierce aerial battle, perhaps the dwarves would have fallen like raindrops. A miracle happened. Almost at the moment when they descended to a height of 100 meters, every dwarf felt the change in the situation. They passed through a thin membrane that was almost invisible to the naked eye. It was freezing and cold. Almost every griffin and its knights shivered. This was a mage's ice barrier? They guessed right. Almost as soon as the last griffin passed through the shield, about 30 dragon breaths landed on the huge ice shield. When the blazing dragon's breath landed on the translucent ice barrier, a strange sizzling sound immediately rang out. It was a clash of heat and cold. The blazing flames evaporated the water on the barrier, and the cold counteracted the invasion of the heat. Amazing. Which breaking dawn great wizard had arrived? Or was this the magical defense system of the Alterac Palace? The dwarves who had already begun to descend handed the task to the griffins. They stared blankly at the hemispherical barrier that looked like a freshly peeled egg flickering under the bombardment of the dragon breaths, as if it would collapse at any moment, as if the flames of death would descend upon them at any moment. However, such a situation did not happen. It did not even deform. It only felt that the ice shards floating on the barrier were becoming denser. At this time, more than one wild hammer dwarf saw Duque standing at the highest point of the castle where the palace was located. The deputy commander of the alliance, the young man who had always been nicknamed the Miracle Man, was like a god descending to earth at this moment. Dozens of huge snowflakes were circling around him. Each hexagonal snowflake was as big as a basin, and they were circling around him in a specific trajectory. Thank you for your support, Kidron. Leave the rest to me, Duque. Duque shouted in an extremely pretentious manner. In the next second, Duque stretched out his 5 fingers with a cold expression. A bluish-white magic rose from the soles of his feet, illuminating Duque's face. From the perspective of the Red Dragon Cavalry, Duque was surrounded by a huge magic formation that was at least 30 meters in diameter. Zulu Hid, who was commanding in the air, had a drastic change in expression. He shouted, "Not good. Run. Don't you think it's too late to escape now?" Duque sneered. A huge storm quickly formed at Duque's feet and spread rapidly. In the blink of an eye, the diameter of the storm was more than 300 meters. The griffins screamed in fear, trembling under the shocking power of this magic. But soon they realized that they were already standing in the eye of the tornado, the safest place. There was nothing happening here. Instead, not far away, the icy wind that was as sharp as a knife was carrying pieces of ice crystals that were constantly spinning. With the swirling and the addition of a large amount of ice aura, these ice crystals quickly turned into huge round flakes, their sharp edges emitting a cold glint under the sun. "Run, run." Zulu Hid, who was high up in the sky, ordered his subordinates to climb as fast as they could. But it was too late. A thick layer of frost had already formed on the surface of the dragon's wings. Although the dragons were not afraid of low temperatures, it was enough to reduce the frequency at which they flapped their wings, greatly reducing their climbing speed. In the next instant, the air seemed to have been sucked away. The giant dragon and its rider screamed in pain as they fell to the ground. What awaited them was a giant tornado of ice blades that kept spinning like a meat grinder. Chapter 422. Alterac Mountain was a very barren place. Apart from snow and rocks, there was almost nothing here. There were no specialties. Even if there were some mines, how could they dig in such terrible weather? Perhaps the snowmen here were the only specialties. Alterac didn't have griffins, but King Eden was afraid of griffins descending upon his castle. Thus he set up a flight restriction magic circle on the castle. It wasn't entirely correct to say that it was a flight restriction. This magic circle mainly removed some of the wind element and increased gravity. Normally speaking, if Duke wanted to make a name for himself in a magic array like this, he would have to extract the wind elements and use them to form an ice storm to kill his enemies. This was a complete paradox. But Duque did it. Under the gazes of the hundreds of wild hammer dwarves and the thousands of Alterac soldiers, everyone saw a huge ice tornado form under Duque's command. It was a huge tornado more than 20 meters above the ground. It was so big that one couldn't see its end. It wrapped around the towering mountains surrounding Alterac City in all 4 directions. The scenery in the distance was already blurry. All that could be seen were faint shadows rising and falling, as well as the faintly discernible mountain range. Apart from the contours of the world, all the landscape was destroyed by the huge spinning ice chunks. The giant dragon falling from the sky let out a powerful roar, but the roar that was full of vigor had long since been drowned out by the howling of the wind, turning into a muffled groan. The giant dragon was sucked into the tornado, its scarlet body quickly blurring and turning into a dark shadow. Just looking at the high-speed spinning made one dizzy, not to mention the terror of being caught in it. Bam! A huge bloody figure was embedded into the mountain to the north of Alterac City. Everyone focused and realized that it was the corpse of a young red dragon with almost all its scales peeled off. Its flesh was a bloody mess and its body was covered in ice. Bam! There was another explosion and a smaller red dragon fell to the ground a little outside the city wall. After falling to the ground, it also lost all sound and movement. Just like that, the red dragons that had landed with great momentum died tragically one after another in the outskirts of the city. No one dared to make a sound. They looked in awe at Duque, who was casting the spell at the top of King City. From time to time he would look at the huge tornado with a diameter of several kilometers. It looked like the storm was boundless. It was like a black hole that swallowed everything, pulling in everything in the sky and stirring it up. Alterac City was like a garbage dump below, but it was also like an isolated island in the middle of a storm. It was so small, which was why the storm was so wide and so powerful. The ferocious griffin was like a docile kitten, crawling on the ground, shivering. The griffin knights who had been through hundreds of battles took off their helmets and paid their utmost respect to the powerful mage who stood at the top of the castle. Everyone seemed to be standing on this safe island, quietly watching the performance of the apocalypse storm. Everyone had lost the ability to speak, silently watching everything. Those who were not familiar with Duque had the deepest respect for Duque. Those who were familiar with Duque were puzzled. Wasn't Duque just a morning star wizard? Even if he had the support of a magic formation, could he do something so ridiculous? In fact, Lucia, who was 1 floor down from the top floor, smiled wryly at the pair of clowns in front of her. Duque, you bastard, are you done yet? This old man can't hold on much longer. At the bottom of the staircase beside Duque's feet, an old man with a white beard, dressed in magnificent epic equipment that blinded all wizards, was cursing loudly. Just a little bit more. I'll be done after dealing with these 5. Duque seemed to be chanting, but he was actually replying. Bah. Just materials for 5 red dragons. This old man looks down on you. The white-bearded old wizard continued to curse, but at least he had some humanity and did not stop immediately. However, the light of the magic circuits that appeared on his body was gradually dimming. Tisk, it's not that I'm the scapegoat, but when you see the materials for a red dragon, a dog, pouncing on it like it's biting a bone. Duque had wanted to say that the dog ate sh*t, but he changed his words. Bastard. You still dare to anger me? Do you believe that I won't take a few more and leave? The white-haired old man continued to curse. Do you believe that when Alexstrasza comes after me in the future, I'll give you up first? I'll kill you first. All right, come. Duque smiled evilly, looking like a dead pig that was not afraid of boiling water. The old man did not utter a word. Lucia could not help but let out a pft. Humph. The two of them ignored each other. Who was this old man? Naturally, he was the Dalajan's greatest, most powerful and most magnificent chairman, Antonidas. After gaining control of the magic formation, the first thing that Duque thought about was how to maximize the results of the battle. Since he wanted to keep the entire Red Dragon Legion here, he alone could not do it. So he used a magic message and dragged Antonidas into the water. Dragons were fierce, but every part of a dragon's body was a treasure. Dragon scales could be made into armor, dragon tendons could be made into powerful siege weapons, dragon skin could be made into magic materials, dragon blood could be made into magic potions. The problem was that not many people in this world dared to slay dragons. That was because the dragon race was a clan, a nest. When the young were killed, the big ones came, and when the big ones were killed, the old ones came. The older they were, the more powerful they were. This was especially true for a large family like the Red Dragons, which had thousands of members. If the Red Dragons went all out, they had the power to flatten a country. So most adventurers and mages could only stare at the treasures the dragons had on them. For thousands of years, they had been waiting for a traitor to appear in the Dragon Clan. Well, actually, there were a few traitors such as the Black Dragon Clan. However, the Black Dragon Clan was extremely arrogant, and they appeared and disappeared mysteriously. Who could catch them? This time, Duque directly proposed to Antonidas that he would slay a large number of dragons in his own name and split the profits with Antonidas. Antonidas could not refuse this temptation at all. Rumor had it that the Red Dragon Queen was being controlled, causing the Red Dragons to join the horde against the alliance. Who knew if Alexstrasza would come after him after she got out of trouble? Now that Duque had sworn that he would take care of the Red Dragon Queen, Antonidas's thoughts became active. In the end, he could not resist the temptation and was dragged down by Duque. The world only saw Duque's arrogance and dominance. Who would know that Antonidas, one of the only 2 Breaking Dawn mages in the world, was at Duque's feet helping him. Moreover, even their magic circuits were the same version. Chapter 423. The advantage of being a transmigrator was on full display at this moment. Knowing that Eden wasn't kind, Duque was able to stop the situation from worsening and turn defeat into victory. Knowing Alexstrasza's true situation, Duque wasn't afraid of the Red Dragon Queen's revenge. Having so many of the dragon race's descendants killed was a very sad thing. But being controlled by Demon's soul for a lifetime, being tortured by the crippled beastman Necros every day without being able to resist, and having to send the Red Dragons to their deaths. This was the true tragedy. As long as Duque broke Demon's soul's control over Alexstrasza, the Red Dragon Queen wouldn't be able to thank him enough. Why would she vent her anger on him for slaughtering her descendants? Thus, Antonidas's fear was completely unfounded. Because of an unlikely event, he felt that he owed Duque a huge favor. Antonidas was also a model of taking advantage of others. Oh, that wasn't entirely true. At the very least, the Red Dragon's scales and skin had earned him quite a bit. Of course, this didn't stop Duque from showing off. At the edge of Alterac City, Horde Chief Orgrim and his old comrades watched this scene in shock. Duke, who was standing on top of the city, was like a god, waving his arms, summoning gales and blades of ice, wantonly splitting the sky, causing the giant dragons in the sky to scream and fall to the mortal world. Not a single dragon could escape the terrifying storm. Not a single dragon had the ability to pass through the storm and give Duque the slightest blow. These overlords of the sky that usually soared in the sky were now no better than pigs in a slaughterhouse, being slaughtered one-sidedly. Orgrim guessed that this was the work of the humans' magic arrays. As a warrior, his knowledge of mysticism was still lacking. However, that sense of crisis and that sense of urgency made Orgrim's mind frantically ring the alarm bells. Seeing the battered and exhausted Zulucid flying over on his last dragon, Orgrim couldn't help but roar, "Is there any news of Ghoul, Dan? The tribe needs his evil power right now." Zulud gritted his teeth and lowered his head. "I've already sent a messenger, but there's no reply." "Then send more messengers. 2 riders to a group, 3 riders to a group. If that doesn't work, then you can go yourself." Orgrim was fuming. He was a little confused. Could it be that every capital city in this world had such a powerful magic defense system? Stormwind City burned down 100,000 orcs. As soon as Kuel Salus entered the country, he had to rely on Ghoul, Dan to break through the magic defense system. Even Alterac, the weakest of the 7 human kingdoms, had a magic formation that could annihilate hundreds of dragons. Wouldn't the magic defense of Lordaeron, the strongest human kingdom, be? Orgrim didn't dare to imagine it. Even after sending Zulu Hit away, Orgrim was still in a bad mood. He could not help but mutter, "Does every kingdom have this many defensive magic circles? That doesn't seem to be the case, Great Chief." A voice that Orgrim didn't recognize sounded. The Great Chief turned around and saw an unfamiliar face. It was a sword saint of the Fireblade clan. This young sword saint seemed to be here to report on a mission. The only thing that Orgrim was curious about was that the sword saint was carrying a human in each hand. Sensing the Great Chief's suspicious gaze, the sword saint immediately explained in the orc language, "Just now, I used Blade Storm to kill a lot of human nobles. But these two young humans with the Duke's insignia have magical defensive devices on their bodies and escaped death. I think they are very important human nobles. Able to block a sword saint's blade storm? There weren't many of such devices, and even if there were, they were very expensive. Orgrim remembered that Samuro had said that he almost killed the king of Stormwind, and that the king did not have such anti-weapon devices. Most beastmen were uncouth, and only a few great chief were willing to learn the common language and human knowledge. However, the Fireblade Sword Saint, who was the strongest assassin and scout of the beastmen, was definitely an exception. Mastering the enemy's language and knowing who was the most valuable target was definitely a necessary lesson for an assassin. Orgrim didn't care about the others, but before he used the spell he had carefully told the Sword Saints about Alterax's noble insignia. Just like the Sword Saint, Orgrim could tell just by looking at the badges of these two young humans. Bear family? Two dukes? Brand new duke insignia? Let's get back to what you were talking about, Sword Saint. As Orgrim spoke in orc language, he flashed a sinister smile at the two young humans who were panicking. The two of them were so scared that they peed their pants. There were obvious water stains on their crotches. The Sword Saint didn't care at all and replied in orc language. I just casually asked them, and they swore that Alterac definitely doesn't have such a terrifying magic defense. Orgrim was overjoyed. He turned to the two of them and spoke in human language. I am the great chief of the Horde, Orgrim Doomhammer. The Horde's plan failed tonight and I am very unhappy. Between the two of you, I'm only going to keep the most valuable one. The useless one will be the ogre's dinner. He purposely grinned, letting his sharp, crisscrossed fangs dangle in front of the two similar-looking fellows. In fact, to the two of them he looked more like an ogre. I'll talk. I'll tell you everything I know. Don't eat me. The older one looked like he was about to cry. No. Listen to me, that useless Wilden doesn't know anything. Don't listen to Alex. Orgrim was annoyed. He roared and pointed at one of them. Shut up. I'll ask you answer. Orgrim asked as he led the dispirited chieftains. But as he asked, Orgrim's eyes lit up. Ha ha ha. The entire mountain path echoed with Orgrim's wild laughter. He patted Kilrog Deadeye's shoulder. We found a treasure. Today is actually the Horde's lucky day. Orgrim didn't expect that what he couldn't accomplish with so many powerful chiefs would be accomplished by the two kids that were captured by the Sword Saint. These two young men weren't just any Tom, Dick, or Harry. They were the two precious sons of Duke Barov, Wilden Barov and Alex Barov. Chapter 424. As representatives of useless nobles with bloodline but no abilities, these two brothers could be said to have displayed their cowardice to the extreme. Historically, these two had always been at odds with each other. Even after their families were destroyed, they still wanted to kill each other. Even after they went to Draenor to open a lumber company, these two hated each other so much that they could not wait for each other to be destroyed so that they could take everything. History took a beautiful turn because of Duque. Duque never thought that these two brothers, who he thought were not worth his attention, would become the deciding factor in the war between the Alliance and the Horde. It was fine if these two brothers had no morals, but the key thing was that they knew a lot. From the geography of each country to their strength and military supplies, they actually knew everything. As the next generation of the Barov family, they were not young anymore. Duke Barov even trained them early and let them deal with family affairs. Alterac was the weakest country. Since they could not send too many soldiers, the Barov family mostly provided food and logistics to the countries of the Alliance to fulfill their obligations as members of the Alliance. Therefore, these two brothers actually knew most of the Alliance's military deployment and the situation around Lordaeron Mill Lake. After all, the three countries around Lordaeron Mill Lake were Lordaeron on the north coast, Dalajan on the south coast, and Alterac in the southeast. My information is absolutely accurate. I go to Lordaeron every year. Wilden shouted, trying to take credit. No. My internal information is correct. Alterac does not have such a strong magic defense system. Alex argued. Haha. There is nothing to argue about. Orgrim laughed and hugged the two brothers affectionately. He made a grand promise. As long as your information helps the Horde take down Alterac and Lordaeron, you will be the heroes of the Horde. Then you will be the heroes of the tribe and you will receive the treatment of a tribal chief. I will also make one of you the king of the humans in the south and the other the king of the humans in the north. Really? Thank you, Chief. I will do my best. The two were so touched that they were about to cry. They did not even notice the strong smell of urine in their pants. The two were ambitious but brainless. They did not know that Orgrim's promise was a trap. He had to take it down first. Secondly, if all the humans on the continent were killed by the tribe, then what was the use of being the so-called king? Kilrog glanced at the two traders and asked in the beastman language, "Are you really going to let them be kings?" Orgrim smiled. Why not? They had lost too many orc laborers. Someone has to make up for it. After the situation in Alterac calmed down, King Eden walked out of the basement under the protection of his guards. The tragic scene in front of him made him want to cry, but no tears came out. Dead. Dead. All dead. The hardcore nobles who supported him had all been turned into minced meat. Eden vomited at a glance. In his eyes, the incomparably beautiful and holy royal city was now in a state of devastation. There were destroyed houses everywhere, and the corpses of dragons and griffins that had fallen to the ground. When the orc chieftain broke out of the encirclement, there were only less than 10 of them, but they were chased and intercepted by half of the Silverhand Knights for Elven Rangers and over 1,000 soldiers. Eden could not imagine how Orgrim would deal with him and his kingdom. Just the thought of Orgrim's ferocious fangs made Eden's legs tremble. Unfortunately, he could not turn back. Duque's appearance had blocked his last hope of turning to the tribe. "Your Majesty, please restrain your grief. But the most important thing now is to evacuate the people. Since the main force of the tribe is not far from here, King Alterac will not be able to defend." Duque spoke as if it was a trivial matter. Wother and the others beside Duque also looked at Eden and his guards with disgust. Duke did not bother with Eden. Although he was the Alliance's vice-commander, he was still not qualified to judge a king. That was something that could only be done after the other kings voted. "Huss, please come here. We need to discuss how to fight this battle." Yes. General Huss's expression was complicated. The king he served was finished. As a human general, he had to carry out his duty for the survival of the human race. He knew that from this moment on, he and his soldiers would have to listen to this ridiculously young commander. Duque did not avoid this and brought Huss and Wother to Alterac's command center. Duke pointed at the shattered ridge where Alterac City was located. "Traps are useless. Orgrim is not an idiot. I've already tricked him with magic traps twice, but I won't do it a third time. Moreover, the broken ridge is too small to defend against too many elites of the Horde. Orgrim won't send too many troops either, so what we need to do is to kill enough of the Horde and then retreat." On the other side, Duke Berev stood at the top of the castle, staring blankly at the mountains in the distance. Today was destined to be Alterac's day of suffering. Alterac did not turn to the tribe, but it was destined to suffer the flames of war. No matter what, King Eden would be nailed to the pillar of shame. Perhaps he would not be able to make a comeback for the next few centuries. The Berev family would not have it easy either. He had thought that with Duque's reminder, the Berev family would be able to jump out of the sinking ship that was Alterac. Duke Berev had thought of many possibilities, such as the Berev family completely breaking away from Alterac and turning to Stormwind, who actually controlled the Hillsbrad Hills. In any case, Hillsbrad was the Berev family's fief. It was just that the ruler had changed in name. Even if King Lang had to bear the shame of losing his capital, it would still be 1,000,000 times better than Eden, who had become a traitor. But now everything was over. Because of the betrayal of the two unfilial sons, the only two successors of the Berev family were on the wrong boat. The Berev family could not avoid being nailed to the pillar of shame. Worst of all, an eyewitness told Duke Berev that his two sons had been kidnapped by the tribe's sword saint. Alex Berev trembled all over. He knew his son's character too well. What if, just as he was about to collapse, King Eden walked over? "Alex, is this the ending you wanted? You and I are finished. Our family is finished. Not only did we not get anything, we have to give up everything." Eden waved his arms in agitation. Duke Berev was speechless. He looked at his childhood friend in a daze, his gaze unfocused. Just as the Duke was about to say something, the two guards beside Eden suddenly flew out. Chapter 425. Duke Berev also had guards behind him. Unfortunately, the two unlucky fellows had just seen their companions suffer and were wondering if they had been hit by an invisible dragon when they were struck by it. Two long, sharp knives pierced their necks from behind. Sword Saint. Another sword saint of the orcs. No one had expected that the Beastman Sword Saint would actually return so quickly. Duke Barav and King Piranha did not expect it, and neither did Duque. At this moment, all the elites in the Broken Ridge were gathered around Duque for a battle conference. King Eden looked at the blood splattering in front of him, and was scared out of his wits. He tried to dodge, but a huge green figure quickly materialized from a blur, cutting off all his hopes. In the next second, a scorching and powerful green arm already gripped his neck, lifting his entire body up. "Don't kill me. I'm the Great Chief's loyal servant." Eden's feet left the ground and he shouted with difficulty. "The Great Chief doesn't need a lowly subordinate like you. Remember, my name is Samuro." The holy swordsman of the horde proudly announced his name in the common tongue. He then beheaded the king of Alterac, one of the 7 human kingdoms of the Lordaeron Alliance, Aiden Piranid. At this moment, time seemed to have frozen. There were more than 30 people around who witnessed this scene, and everyone's face was filled with fear. Looking at the head that was spinning in the air and flying high into the sky, looking at the head that was wearing the supreme golden crown on its forehead, everyone forgot to breathe. After their lungs exhaled the hot air, they could no longer inhale any fresh air. This was the head of a king. Before the head could fly for half a meter, it was grabbed by Samuro's left hand. Then Samuro looked at Duke Barav with a gaze that symbolized the god of death, and his huge fangs glinted in the sunlight. "Duke Barav, your 2 sons asked me to send their regards to you. You're better off dead. As long as you're alive, they won't be able to become the legitimate heir of the Barav family." Samuro's clear common language made Duke Barav feel as if he had fallen into an abyss. Although he had long since anticipated that things would develop in a bad direction, he had never imagined that his 2 sons, who were worse than beasts, would not only learn from Eden and betray the humans, but also be so heartless as to ask the tribe's sword saint to take his life. His breathing had stopped and his heart had forgotten to beat. At this moment, Duke Barav had already accepted his fate. 2 streams of tears rolled down his wrinkled face. Who would have thought that his illustrious reputation would be ruined in the hands of his 2 scum sons? Perhaps this was the result of him being too busy with his career and not disciplining his children. Just when everyone was in despair, a dazzling flash of light suddenly appeared between Duke Barav and Samuro's falling longsword. Dang! In Samuro's eyes, the dark blue ice barrier was like a huge block of ice that had suddenly appeared. This solid block of ice mercilessly rejected Samuro's attempts to raise his martial merit further. Duque had arrived. Using his powerful spatial sense and positioning ability, he flashed 3 times consecutively and ran from the command room to the roof. He had blocked this crucial attack. Samuro's sharp pupils constricted at lightning speed. Duke Marcus. Even though his entire body was sealed in ice, and even though he seemed to have used his last trump card, as the most feared enemy of the entire tribe, he seemed to have an endless supply of trump cards. Samuro believed that he could firmly suppress a Morning Star wizard who had used his trump card, but killing him would consume too many skills and waste too much time. His target was King Eden. As a sword saint with high attack and low defense, his use was reflected in concealment and surprise attacks. Without concealment and having lost the initiative, how could a sword saint go head-on against a powerful wizard with an infinite number of control techniques? Samuro did not hesitate to pull away and dodge. It was not just him. All the sword saints of the tribe did the same. Even though Duque quickly cancelled the ice barrier, he could not stop the high-speed sword saint from jumping onto the roof of a tall building beside the castle. When Duque flashed over again and prepared to use the system elf's powerful scanning ability to find and kill Samuro, who had entered the Gale Step state, another sword saint appeared beside Duke Barav. Duque had no choice but to flash back again. That sword saint had been killed by Duque in an instant, but Duque had completely lost sight of Samuro. 30 minutes later, in the tribe's temporary camp, Orgrim let out the loudest and most heartfelt laughter since he had landed on Lordaeron. Ha! Ha! The head of a human king. Ha! The head of King Eden, who had died with grievances, was Samuro's most outstanding achievement. The golden crown on Eden's forehead told every orc chief of the night's harvest. Samuro, you're the chief meritorious service today. I'll allow you to carry this head around the entire camp. Thank you, chief. Samuro's eyes were filled with ecstasy. This was the highest honor a horde warrior could receive. Orgrim punched the Alterac Kingdom's capital on the map. Today Today is the day of victory for the Horde. We are going to destroy the capital of the Alliance. The entire Horde camp was in an uproar. The head of a king. This was the first time they had obtained the head of a despicable human king since the start of the war. Every Horde warrior raised the weapons in their hands and let out a loud roar, releasing the grievances they had been suppressing for a long time. Yes, this was the glory of the Horde. This was the orcs' military achievement. Orgrim walked up to the high platform of the camp and took Eden's head from Samuro's long sword. He raised it up high and a tsunami of cheers erupted from below. Today is the day of victory for the Horde. We will use the head of a human king and the destruction of a human kingdom to tell all living beings on this continent that going against the Horde is destined to fail. It will definitely be destroyed. Today is the day of glory for the Horde warriors. Let us take this victory with our own hands. Loktar. Loktar. 50,000 voices rang out in unison. The Horde moved out with unparalleled killing intent. With a thirst for victory. A thirst for fresh blood. The thunderous footsteps could be heard even from a few kilometers away. Duque, who was overseeing the broken ridge, had a blank look in his eyes. His face was green. After thinking for a long time, Duque let out a long sigh and waved his hand. Pass down my order. Everyone retreat immediately. Why? General Haas's neck was red. Because Eden is dead, the Horde's morale is at its peak. But because our king is dead, the soldiers desire revenge for his majesty. Haas's eyes were bloodshot. I have a message for you and your soldiers. What is it? Keep the land but lose the people. Keep the people but lose the land but recover. Duque said something that the people of Azeroth could not understand. On this day the capital of the Alterac kingdom fell. Chapter 426. The Alterac kingdom was destroyed. Orgrim was smart enough to control the number of orcs that attacked. 3,000 people, half of them elites and half of them soldiers. More than 2,000 of them were orcs, many of them were trolls and dozens of ogres. This was a number that tested Duque's mental fortitude. Duque had been using a high ratio of casualties and Orgrim had noticed this. That was why Orgrim attacked with a force that was close to teasing Duque. Alterac's mountainous terrain was a natural barrier for humans, but not for the Horde. Duque only sent the Silverhand Knights and the Windrunner sisters to guard the rear, and did not defend to the death. Reality proved that Duque's decision was right. General Haas, who was not far from Duque, saw many trolls with white and blue skin climbing up the cliffs around the broken ridge. They were throwing spears at the Holy Knights from above. They are Frostmane trolls, a branch of the Frost trolls. They have been active in the Bronzebeard dwarves Dan Moeller. Now they seem to have been recruited by the Horde, Duque said calmly. He could almost imagine that if they defended to the death, the Holy Knights might be able to hold on, but the normal human warriors would definitely collapse under such a three-dimensional attack. Alterac did not have the protection of snow in the summer. After the Silver Hand Paladins retreated, the entire capital city was set ablaze. The warriors of the tribe roared loudly and wantonly celebrated the destruction and conquest. Duque's face twitched as he snorted coldly. He saw the orcs pulling out large amounts of frozen meat and other rations from the cellar. In the cold Alterac there was frozen soil 2 meters below the ground. It was the best place to make an ice cellar. Most of the Horde were people who did not mind meat. This batch of meat would obviously be a strong support for the Horde in attacking Lordaeron. Duque could not help but sigh. Orgrim had succeeded in the end. Although the situation was not as bad as the original history, it was not much better. In the original timeline, the Second Battle of the Dark Portal had completely changed the fate of the Alterac kingdom and the Bear family. The treacherous King Eden surrendered to the Orc army and launched a counterattack against the Alliance army. They incited peasant riots in the areas controlled by the Alliance. The rebels repeatedly harassed the Dalajan troops around Hillsbrad, preventing them from supporting the Alliance forces fighting on other fronts. Very soon, the actions of the Alterac kingdom incurred the wrath of the Dalajan mages. The Dalajans swiftly and decisively dispatched an army to completely destroy the Alterac kingdom and raze it to the ground. This was the Alterac ruins in the future. 10 minutes later, Duque saw the Knights of the Silver Hand who did not have many scars and the Windrunner sisters, who were covered in sweat. Wuther seemed a little dissatisfied. Deputy Commander-in-Chief, Why did you send out the retreat signal so early? We can still kill more tribes. In Duque's eyes, Uther was not a qualified commander. His leadership was limited and he did not see the big picture well enough. He was like the most perfect saint, spurring everyone to move forward with almost strict faith. Uther was indeed the most perfect flag, but not everyone was willing to live a more puritanical life than a Puritan. Most of the time, Duque only used Uther as a fierce general. Duque smiled faintly. This is not a good place for a decisive battle. If you were somewhere else you could kill 100 horde warriors in an hour. Here you can only kill 40. Save your strength, there is still war to fight. Pack up, we will immediately set off for Lordaeron. If we don't leave now, the tribes will reach your home before us. Not only Uther but Sidan and Theon, the paladins from Lordaeron, also raised their eyebrows. Ignoring the paladins, Duque turned to General Haas and said, "Bring the Eagle Knights and all the infantry you can muster and follow me." Haas was stunned. He turned to look at the Alterac refugees in the distance. What about the Alterac citizens? Leave them to the local garrison. What if the horde attacks them? Haas and the other Alterac generals were anxious. Duque's eyes sharpened. His sharp gaze reminded Haas of the eagles that were flying over the snowy mountains, about to pounce on the prey. I've been fighting with Orgrim for so long. Do you think I don't know what he's planning? Believe me, before Orgrim split up to attack the Broken Ridge, he had already led the majority of his troops to Lordaeron. Who knows, they might arrive even faster than we thought. Elucia's eyes were red as she silently stood behind Duque. She knew what Duque meant. Her two goddamn brothers were leading the way for the horde. With them leading the way, the main force of the horde would pass through the Alterac mountains at a terrifying speed. Duque had guessed correctly. Other than the 5,000 soldiers that Orgrim had sent to the rear, the rest of the main force had begun their rapid march in the afternoon. Just as the Bear brothers had said, the Alterac army had given up on these roads. Even if there were a few bunkers on the road, the Bear brothers would shout at them with the contract they got from King Eden, and the soldiers in the bunkers would quickly retreat. This was an era where information was scarce. Other than the commanders of the Alliance, the king and the generals, no one had the right to receive magical messages. Most of the messages were delivered by horse. The subordinates of the lesser nobles did not know that their lord was dead, but after seeing his signature and seal, they quickly retreated from the bunkers. Orgrim was able to quickly lead his soldiers through these narrow checkpoints. He thought that the Bear brothers would be of some use, and he was pleased to find out that his thinking was correct. The road ahead was still very dangerous. The orcs and trolls did not mind climbing the mountains, but the ogres were much more troublesome. Without Gujar, their movements were much slower. For a stone path like this, as long as there were a few soldiers blocking the way, once the corpses piled up, the ogres would not be able to pass through. Orgrim was not willing to give up on the ogres, especially the twin-headed ogre warriors. So he urged his army to quickly advance. He knew that once his army passed through the mountains, no one would be able to stop the horde's giant axe from cutting into the heart of the Alliance. Once he succeeded, Grom Hellscream, who was trapped in the Silverpine Forest, would be freed. Based on his understanding of humans, most of them would rather give up a large piece of land in order to gather all their forces to protect their capital. Chapter 427. The main force of the horde spent 2 days traversing the snow-covered mountains, descending west to the hilly region. Until now, the beastmen had not seen a single human. Some of the warriors even grumbled that they had lost the chance to kill. However, the conquerors of the Alterac kingdom caught up from behind and triggered their nerves. Their great chieftain assured them that they would soon have that opportunity. Yes, they would have the chance. 3 days ago, when news of Alterac's destruction spread, Lordaeron, and even the entire Alliance had a heated argument. In the command tent of Lordaeron's front line between Silverpine Forest and Tirisful Glades, a noble general roared like a madman, "That kid in the vice-commander's seat is an idiot. We gave him 50,000 troops, but he still let the horde get under our noses." Mograine, who knew Duque the best, mocked him with clear disdain. "If you lead the army, you'll only give 50,000 to those barbaric green monsters. Retreat. Fail. Lose the capital. This is the second in the Alliance to lose the capital. Who's next? Lordaeron? Ironforge or Riptide Keep? Are we competing to see who will fall faster?" No, we must keep the initiative in the hands of the people of Lordaeron. Your Majesty, you should use your influence to take back the position of commander and vice-commander. Another duke jumped out and slammed the table, attracting everyone's attention. His suggestion was immediately echoed by many nobles. Bang! 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 He slammed the table and Mograine did the same. As one of the few nobles who was extremely powerful, Mograine was not inferior to anyone in terms of making noise. Watch your mouth. Duke Shade. Changing the commander will only cause more chaos. Mograine's exposed muscles bulged, his veins bulging. The two commanders you speak of have done a good job. Under their leadership we killed 500,000 beastmen. The only reason for this is that there are too many damned greenskins. The one called Santos did not give up. If His Majesty Menethil leads us, we can kill 1,000,000 orcs. Admittedly, this was a very skillful bootlicker. If it was any other time, King Tyrrhena's would have accepted it with a smile. Unfortunately, this was a time when they needed the help of the allies the most. The King of Lordaeron, who was sitting on the highest seat, said calmly, "If I were the commander, there would be no alliance." The nobles immediately shut up. The white-haired King Tyrrhena's rubbed his temples and turned to look at his best commander, High Lord Mograine. "What is your opinion?" "My Mograine. We can only retreat. The best soldiers of Lordaeron have been transferred here. The remaining city guards can't possibly deal with the core elites of the Horde. If the combat power of this Horde is as terrifying as Deputy Commander-in-Chief Marcus described," a few of the nobles stood up like cats whose tails had been stepped on. However, Tyrrhena's raised his hand and gestured for them to keep quiet, and they could only hold it in. "We don't have enough soldiers to fight on two fronts, so my answer is, yes." Ignoring the murderous gazes of the nobles whose fiefs were in the Tirisful woodlands, Mograine gritted his teeth. "We don't have enough troops to fight on two fronts, so my answer is, yes. My Majesty. We cannot afford to lose Lordaeron." Everyone knew this, but it was a different story when it came to the Horde. Everyone knew that the Horde was a swarm of locusts that would consume all the resources wherever they went. The Horde was a nomadic people and they had no concept of sustainable development. They hunted all the beasts in the forest and cut down all the trees. When they had no other choice, they would let the laborers feed the animals with plants. For example, the pigs captured from the humans were very much to the beastmen's liking. After fighting in the Silverpine forest for so long, they had almost destroyed the entire forest. It was summer and it was difficult to find a tree with green leaves. Once they retreated, the Silverpine forest would become the template for the future Tirisful woodland. Now that they saw the bitter faces of the Tirisful woodland lords, the lords of Silverpine Forest who had suffered for a long time felt like gloating over their misfortune. However, retreating to Lordaeron was also a painful choice. After being surrounded by the Horde from both east and west, Lordaeron would lose all contact with their own territory. If they wanted to get supplies, they could only rely on Lake Lordaeron. To the east of the lake was a mountain, to the west was the destroyed Silverpine Forest, and to the south was the Dalagen. The Dalagen had never been known for their food production. What was particularly ironic was that the grain production area controlled by the refugees from the Stormwind Kingdom in Hillsbrad had become the backbone of the Alliance's food supply a year later. Alright, next topic. Since we've decided to retreat, how do we do it? The Horde in the Silverpine Forest had obviously received the news, and their attacks had become more frequent in the past 2 days. "If we retreat now, we'll all be wiped out if the Horde catches up to us," Mograine warned solemnly. "In principle, we have to leave some troops behind to cover our retreat." Hearing this, many lords' facial muscles twitched and they lowered their heads. Some even took small steps back, afraid that their king would take a liking to them. Tyrrhena's expression did not look good. He waved his hand and a servant immediately handed Mograine a note. "I'm not very familiar with military matters. This is an idea that Duque gave me using magic. What do you think?" Mograine's eyes lit up when he saw it. He said excitedly, "He really is a military genius." Grom Hellscream personally led the army to attack the northern defense line of the Silverpine Forest. As a pure warrior, he did not know much about strategy. Since Orgrim had sent him a letter to lead the army to the north, he continued to send small groups of troops to attack. The humans' performance when they had a solid base was much worse than when they were fighting in the wild. If these guys were allowed to return to Lordaeron, it would definitely increase the difficulty of the attack by a few levels. For the past few days, there had been continuous drumming in the north, as if telling the horde that they were on guard. In reality, as soon as the horde's troops got close, the drumming would become more intense, and according to the scale of the horde's attack, more human troops would pour out from the camp. The annoying paladins disappeared for 2 days and then returned. The silver paladins even personally killed small groups of troops. This situation lasted for 3 days, and then Grum suddenly realized that something was wrong. Oh no, the humans are escaping. Chapter 428. The hanging sheep beating the drum was a trick used by the ancestors of Wuxia. It was definitely something new for the tribes. When Grum led his army towards the Lordaeron camp that had at least 100,000 people, he only saw less than 1,000 cavalrymen and dozens of paladins torturing his small army. Go, go. On the plains, those with 2 legs could never outrun those with 4 legs. No matter how much Grum stared, he could only watch as the last troops of the Rotterdam kingdom left them in the dust, while the tribe could only eat dirt behind them. In fact, the Lordaeron army that retreated 2 days earlier could not make it back to Lordaeron. The terrain of the Tirisful forest itself limited the speed of retreat. Not to mention, the 100,000 troops were squeezed on a forest road that only allowed 2 carriages to travel side by side. No matter how fast they marched, it would take them at least a week to reach Lordaeron. There were not many kings in this era who dared to use teleportation. King Tyrrhenas was almost going crazy. He had seen the orcs' godly skill of attacking cities with his own eyes. 2 orcs carrying a tree trunk dared to rush towards the gate of the city. If left alone, the gates would be opened in 2 to 3 minutes. Quick, quick, quick. My Kalia. My Arthas. Tyrrhenas' heart broke when he thought of his wife and children who were still in Lordaeron. Unlike most other kings, Tyrrhenas had children at an old age. He only had Kalia when he was almost 40 and then Arthas. In this era where people married early and had children early, it was not wrong to say that he had children at an old age. He did not spoil his children very much, but he loved them as much as any father in the world. Tyrrhenas had already asked Mograine to abandon the army and lead the Lordaeron knights back. He was still afraid that they would not make it in time. In fact, the horde had already arrived a day before the vanguard of the Lordaeron army arrived. Your Highness! Your Highness! The orcs are attacking. Arthas, who was in the palace, was stunned. He raised his handsome but childish face and looked blankly at Melev, the captain of the royal guards, who had rushed into the palace in a hurry. What? It was not that the Rotterdam kingdom did not receive the news. In fact, when Alterac royal city fell 2 days ago, Duque had already sent a magical message. Duque repeatedly warned that the tribe would likely arrive within 3 days, but none of the people from the Rotterdam could come up with a solution. Many nobles believed that it was impossible for the tribe to reach the Broken Ridge within 3 days because it would take at least 7 days for the humans to travel by land. When King Tyrrhenas was not in Lordaeron, Arthas was in charge of the kingdom. Of course, the 13-year-old Arthas was already quite assertive, but because of his age he was still more of a mascot. At this moment he completely ignored the nobles who were waiting to be summoned and were now whispering in fear. He suddenly stood up and waved his hand, gesturing for Molev to come forward. The orcs have arrived? Yes, Your Highness, the guard captain answered quickly. Melev was an experienced soldier. When he was young, Tyrrhenas had promoted him from a border guard to a guard. As time passed, he slowly rose to become the captain of the guards. Arthas knew him very well. Molev wasn't a coward. Right now his face was pale and his body was trembling. They crossed the Alterac mountains earlier than expected. In fact, by the time I reported to Your Highness, they should have already advanced to the shores of Lordaeron Lake. Arthas quickly walked past the guard captain and strode out of the inner palace. He practically jogged with the guards through the hall, climbed up the spiral staircase of the nearest tower, and walked to the nearest balcony. The melodious sound of a piano could be heard. The sound was so soft and pure that it seemed to make all the anxiety in one's heart disappear. It was the sound of Arthas's sister, Kalia. This was Kalia's piano room. When Arthas barged in wearing leather armor, the maids who were waiting by the piano as well as Kalia herself, all raised their heads in shock. They stared blankly at Arthas, who was followed by Molev and the other guards rushing in. Arthas? Princess Kalia asked tentatively. It's an emergency. Arthas waved his hand and quickly walked past them. Princess Kalia immediately realized the seriousness of the situation. She lifted her snow-white dress and trotted all the way to the balcony after Arthis. Then she was stunned. The two siblings felt as if they were struck by lightning. There was a buzzing sound in their ears and they could not hear anything. All other irrelevant things in their field of vision were filtered out. They stood there motionless like marble statues. From the high east balcony, they could see the most beautiful scenery in the whole of Lordaeron. Nearby was the blue, sparkling Lordaeron lake that was as wide as the sea. In the distance, there was the endless, undulating Alterac mountains like a barrier. At this moment the scenery was still so breathtaking and majestic. However, on the empty grassland between the scenery and the white city walls of the Rotterdam kingdom, there was a group of green people that were constantly squirming. This bright green torrent, which had nothing to do with nature, kept twisting and turning. It was like locusts eroding the entire grassland, spreading all the way to the shore of the lake. It was as if they wanted to fill everything in their field of vision with this green. This was not an illusion. Deputy Commander Duke Marcus' repeated warnings were not alarmist talk. This time the horde had really come. With an unyielding murderous intent. With an endless amount of destruction. Arthis heard the screams of the maids behind him. However, other than the sound of his sister's breathing, he could not hear anything else. Molev. Arthis's roar woke the captain of the knights, who was staring at the scene in the distance with his mouth wide open. Your Highness. Molev quickly lowered his head. Sound the alarm. Close the city gates immediately. Get all the soldiers to the top of the wall. Other than defending the city walls, there is no other way to defend against their first wave of attack. Arthis, who was very assertive, made his decision. But Your Highness, there are still thousands of refugees waiting for inspection outside the east gate. Arthis's cheek muscles twitched. Just force the door open. There are at least 3,000 refugees outside. Molev looked like he was about to cry. Arthis slapped him. Idiot. These 3,000 people are dead for sure. If we sacrifice 300,000 people in Lordaeron to save 3,000 people, we will be the sinners of Lordaeron. Go. Now. The captain covered his face and quickly left. Chapter 429. Prince Arthas was right. This was the only way he could save the majority of his people. To be so resolute at such an inexperienced age was definitely a rare and valuable quality. Arthas was also wrong. This was the same as abandoning his own people, even if it was only a small part of them. In this era where sacrifice, courage, and chivalry were emphasized, most kings who were brave enough would choose to send their generals or even personally lead the army to fight for a chance of survival for their citizens who had yet to enter the city. Princess Kalia covered her mouth and nose in shock, looking at Arthas in disbelief. It was as if she had just met Arthas for the first time, and not as a good brother and sister who had been in love with each other for 13 years. Sister. Father took away almost all the generals and mages. He didn't even leave any champion knights for me. Arthas complained angrily. Yes, no matter how brave a general was, he could not lead a group of pigs to victory. The pressure on the western front was too great. In the Silver Pine Forest, Grom Hellscream's ferocious attack was undoubtedly the best feint. King Tyrrhena's was forced to take away almost every professional soldier in Lordaeron, except for the royal guards. Other than a small number of archers, most of the soldiers defending the city were farmers who only knew how to use pitchforks a month ago. They could not even put on their armor. Sister, you stay here. After saying this, Arthas left Kalia in a daze and walked down the tower. Molev followed closely behind. Molev. Send a small team of royal guards to stand by. If the east gate is breached, immediately bring my sister to the west and find my father. Your Highness, what about you? As long as the men of the Menethil family are not dead, no one can take Lordaeron away from us. Arthas's voice was sonorous. Send my order. Have all the generals on standby lead their troops to the east gate. Arthas quickly put on a slightly larger set of exquisite armor. This was a gift from his father, King Tyrrhena's, when he was 12 years old. The precocious young Arthas looked mighty and majestic, but that was all. His body hadn't fully grown yet, so he couldn't pick up the warhammer he wanted to use the most. He could only grit his teeth and pick up a large double-edged broadsword. When he rode his horse to the east gate under the escort of the guards, he was shocked to find that the gate was still open. A large number of citizens from the surrounding towns and villages of Rotterdam City had yet to enter the city. Because they were reluctant to part with their life's wealth, they became even more flustered when they heard the rumbling footsteps behind them. They desperately tried to squeeze into the narrow city gate with their belongings. Arthis grabbed the guard's breastplate. "I've given the order to close the gates immediately. Why didn't you close the door? Do you want to kill 300,000 citizens of Rotterdam?" The guard at the gate argued loudly, "But they are our neighbors and good friends. I know quite a few of them. Sister Mary, the traveling merchant Anon who always goes to the Silver Pine Forest. They're here," Molov exclaimed. Arthis followed the guard captain's finger and looked to the east. It was different from the view from the balcony of the tower. From this angle he could first see a small forest a kilometer away, then the lake further away. At this moment the fastest group of orcs had already rushed out of the small forest. The orcs were charging at a very fast speed. Although they were not as fast as the fastest horses, they were not much different from the full speed of a pack horse. Arthis grabbed the monocular from the hands of a general next to him, and he immediately saw a shocking scene. These green-skinned beasts had the same body size as the strongest humans. They had explosive muscles and huge beast-like heads. However, he couldn't see any large siege weapons except for some heavy logs that he thought were giant warhammers, and some crudely made but shockingly long ladders. What shocked Arthis the most was that the height of these ladders matched the height of the city walls of Rotterdam. Other than that, what entered his vision were giant hammers, axes, and extremely blunt swords that humans couldn't wield. He was also sure that they definitely had iron hooks and ropes. They were unimaginably barbaric, but they had extraordinary intelligence. "Ah!" The people under the city gate screamed even louder. They crazily squeezed into the city gate, pushing and shoving each other. The more panicked they were, the more they squeezed into the city gate. The drawbridge of the moat was filled with people and animals pulling carts. Arthis's eyes almost popped out of his head when he saw a carriage overturned on the drawbridge. A horrifying scene appeared in his and the other guards' minds. In less than 10 minutes, those brutal green-skinned beasts would step over the corpses of these idiots who wanted to squeeze into the city. They would rush into Rotterdam through the city gate that was wide open because of these guys, turning the entire city into a sea of fire and pushing 300,000 people into hell. "Shoot! Shoot at those mobs!" Arthis's fierce shout was like that of a devil. "But those are our brothers and sisters," the guard at the city gate shouted. He looked like he was about to cry. The next moment his voice stopped abruptly. He had never imagined that his head would be cut off by the most respected Prince Arthas with a single strike. At least 100 people witnessed this scene, and each of them was so shocked that their mouths were wide open, unable to close. "Bastard! For the safety of 300,000 people. In the name of Arthis Menethil, I order you all to shoot. Otherwise all of you will die with these mobs." The thunderous shout finally woke up the stunned archers. They gritted their teeth with tears in their eyes and started shooting. The citizens of Rotterdam who were rushing into the city cried even louder. They would never imagine the scene of their own country's soldiers shooting at them even in their nightmares. Almost instantly, there was not a single living creature on the entire drawbridge. The citizens near the moat beside the drawbridge screamed in fear and scrambled to escape from this land of death. "Shoot anyone who dares to go near the drawbridge," Arthis shouted with tears in his eyes. "Melov, take some people and push everything on the drawbridge into the moat. Then raise the drawbridge as fast as possible." Melov did as he was told. They pulled every single citizen who was still in shock into the city and pushed most of the corpses and debris into the moat. However, an overturned carriage was firmly pinned down on the drawbridge. It was a carriage that carried food. The 2 horses were already dead. However, the dead horses' corpses and the food that was tied up too well were at least 2 tons heavy. It was not something that could be solved by manpower. In the past, such a situation would take a long time. Now it was almost impossible to solve it in less than 10 minutes. Chapter 430. In the distance, Orgrim was overjoyed at the sight. "Ancestors above! Attack that gate!" The great chief's voice inspired every beastman around him. The beastmen who did not participate in the destruction of Alterac shouted loudly. The great chief had promised that they would have the chance to kill and destroy. Now it was time for the great chief to fulfill his promise. The beastman warriors seemed to be on steroids. Their footsteps quickened as they charged forward. On the other side, Arthas was distraught. Some sharp-eyed archers saw to him that the orcs were carrying some crude, pre-made bridges to cross the moat. This kind of preparation was very different from what he knew of the beastmen. Furthermore, those huge wooden bridges were not something that humans could carry. But in his field of vision, there were only 2 beastmen carrying these wooden bridges. The most unimaginable thing was that these beastmen were actually wearing thick iron armor. What kind of terrifying power was this? From the tower, the beastmen looked like ants swarming across the empty space. They quickly rushed across the empty space and approached the city walls. Arthas was shocked by the sheer number of them. These brutal beasts killed more than 2,000 people who were still lingering outside the moat in front of the Lordaeron guards as if they were cutting melons and vegetables. No, some people looked at the beastmen with hatred, while others secretly glanced at Prince Arthas. Arthas did not notice because the beastmen had already filled his eyes. Now, from the nearest point of his field of vision to the far distance, to the grasslands and groves by the edge of Lordaeron Lake, to the valley where the cliffs of the mountains split open, he saw a dense crowd of orcs. His dream of waiting for his father to lead the army back was shattered. The horde was already there. They filled the valley and surrounded the city. Now the whole city looked like a dead leaf on a tree in autumn about to fall. In the magic transmission mirror, Arthas had seen how the beastmen treated the fallen shattered ridge. He did not want that scene to happen again. The young prince worked hard. He had initially ordered the ballistae to shoot at the beastmen, but the effect was terrible. If it was a human army that was lined up neatly, one shot from a ballista could kill at least 10 people. The orcs who were charging in a scattered manner were clearly the bane of ballistae, which dealt high single target damage but did not have large AoE attacks. Most of the ballistae did not hit their targets, which made the already flustered defenders very frustrated. Soon the orcs entered the range of the archers. Fire! The scene of the enemies falling to the ground one after another did not happen. These terrifying monsters were wearing armor that was thicker than that of humans. Just by hearing the clanking of arrows, Arthas estimated that the armor of these monsters was at least 1/3 of an inch, 8 millimeters, thick. Arthas suddenly came to a realization. That's right. The military manual that was personally written by the Alliance's Vice Commander Duke Marcus and distributed to all the Alliance's high-ranking generals had a line that said that bows and arrows were useless against the strong orcs. Only heavy javelins could kill orcs better. Javelins? Where are our javelins? Arthas bellowed. They've all been transferred away by His Majesty, Molev said with a sad face. In the midst of hesitation and panic, a large number of orcs had already rushed past the firing range of the long-range weapons. Thousands of orcs threw crude wooden bridges onto the moat, and some orcs who could not wait any longer even began to cross the river. Arthas' heart sank. It was midsummer, and because of the temperature, the water level of the entire Lordaeron Lake had dropped. The water level of the moat that connected to Lordaeron Lake had also dropped. It was only about 2 meters deep. To most humans this was a disaster. But for the huge and burly orcs who were over 7 feet to 1 m tall, it was a depth that they could easily cross. He did not know why the orcs were so confident that they could directly jump into the water, but it was obvious that the orcs had planned this beforehand and they had succeeded. The orcs either rushed over the bridge or crossed the river with crude shields to protect their heads. The orcs began to use huge wooden ladders to climb the city wall. Because the wooden ladders were generally too heavy and had barbs, the defenders could not push them away at all. The gate can't hold on any longer. A scream made Arthas tremble. Only 4 orcs rushed over the suspension bridge, and they used huge logs as battering rams to violently attack the gate. The gorgeous white gate seemed to be on the verge of collapse. If the huge gate had not been well covered with iron sheets, the huge impact alone would have been enough to blow the gate open. From this angle, Arthas could not see the whole thing clearly, but he could hear the sound of wood cracking and metal twisting. Arthas knew that the gate would not be able to hold on for long. The Prince of Lordaeron shook his head frantically, trying to put the shouts behind him. He was distraught. More than one orc had climbed up the city wall not far from the archer tower he was standing on. He immediately realized that if he did not leave quickly when the surrounding city walls were all occupied by orcs, he would be surrounded and killed in this archer tower. Molev obviously realized this as well. He waved his hand and the royal guards rushed down the spiral ladder to open a path for Arthas. The result was not good. In just a short 10 seconds, Arthas had already heard the screams of at least 7 people before they died. "Your Highness, hurry up and leave." Molev's voice came from below. Arthas quickly swung his legs. The metal leg armor made his steps a little heavy, but he maintained his balance well. The scene in front of him suddenly brightened. He came out of the narrow staircase door of the Archer Tower, and the terrible sound of fierce fighting suddenly rushed towards him. This sound was completely different from the sound of the Archer Tower, which was 2 or 3 stories higher than the city walls. Arthas was stunned for a moment. A second later he immediately discovered that there was a burly green-skinned orc waving a warhammer at him. His mouth was wide open, revealing his sharp fangs. He waved his heavy warhammer. Arthas had no choice but to swing his sword to meet the orc's sledgehammer. Bang! After a muffled sound of metal and wood colliding, the prince was sent flying. He hit the battlements and saw stars. He painfully realized that he was not an adult warrior. Even though he had a burly body that far surpassed his peers and trained himself strictly, his muscles were still not perfect. His strength was still not at its peak. "Your Highness." Molev rushed out like lightning, stabbing the orc who tried to attack Arthas with his spear. At this moment, every single person from Rotterdam heard the roar of the city gate collapsing. Chapter 431. The moment Arthas stood on the city wall again, he felt the heavy impact. The vibration made his teeth chatter, and his arm armor hit his leg armor, producing a clear knocking sound. Even the battlements beside him were shaking. Although it was not a good thing to let the orcs cross the city wall and enter the city, it was better to let the orcs climb the city wall than to let them pass through the city gate quickly. At least the guards on the city wall had not given up. Behind them was the city of Lordaeron where their families were. This gave the guards great courage. Under the command of the low-ranking officers, they used their spears to kill the orcs even though their hands were trembling. If there is no way to form a tight formation to fight against the orcs, then for the unskilled recruits, using spears will at least have a better chance of killing the orcs than using swords and shields. Yes. At least in the middle distance, the recruits with spears still had a chance to kill the orcs. The orcs' open and wide moves were not difficult to break. Even for the recruits, they would most likely hit the target with their spears. As for where they would hit, it would depend on whether Lady Luck was on their side. "Hold on," he shouted to a lieutenant who was standing near the city gate and looking up. "Call some people over and block the city gate." "With what, Your Highness?" the slightly panicked young officer asked Arthas. "With anything you can find," Arthas replied. He looked outside the city wall and saw the countless orcs. The orcs who were attacking and preparing to destroy the city that he was supposed to inherit. Arthas's face was filled with the darkest despair. On the high tower of the palace, Princess Kalia clenched her hands and looked into the distance nervously. Nearby, everything was the same as before. The round towers with a white background were all magnificent. Beside the huge towers were gorgeous flying buttresses inlaid with all kinds of exquisite carvings. These supporting pillars that extended from the sides of the towers surrounded and protected the towers well. Just like the vast territory of Lordaeron, they surrounded and protected the most beautiful pearl of the Lordaeron continent, Lordaeron City. But in the distance, death and destruction were spreading. Even if they were unwilling, after the east gate of Lordaeron City was knocked down, the huge crash could be heard clearly even in the palace 2 kilometers away. "Your Highness Kalia, Her Highness Arthas has ordered us to escort you out of Lordaeron immediately if the east gate is breached." A captain of the Wang family's guards stood at the entrance of Kalia's piano room with a group of solemn-looking guards. Ignoring the trembling of the beautiful maids beside her, Kalia put down her binoculars and pointed at the silver-white figures on the city wall. Those were the warriors of Rotterdam. They didn't take down the city walls. The beautiful princess was still trying to defend herself. The tears rolling down her exquisite face broke the guards' hearts. If there's a hero who can block the city gates now, Lordaeron can still be saved. Rotterdam could still be saved. The entire Rotterdam alliance can still be saved. Although he did not have the heart to break the fantasy of the young and beautiful princess, the guard captain was still loyal to his duty. "I'm sorry, Your Highness, we can't hope for a miracle. The truth is that the alliance's army has yet to arrive, and the east gate of Lordaeron has already been breached. Many battles have proven that humans are unable to withstand the attacks of the orcs in urban warfare." "No. Oh come. Princess Kalia said in a different tone. Then, as if to strengthen her tone, she clenched her fists and straightened her curvaceous body, emphasizing loudly, "He'll definitely come." Who was he? The guards did not know, but every maid beside Kalia knew. Who was that he? Ever since he gave the princess that unique and beautiful magic rose, her heart had been captured by him. Every night she would dream of him. Every morning, reading the battle reports about him was the most important morning lesson for the princess. Every time she saw how he wiped out so many orcs with his brilliance, and every time she saw how he brought a powerful ally to the alliance, the princess's face would blush like a young girl in love. That's right. He was the only hero in the princess' heart. The young hero who captured her heart, saved countless people and led the entire alliance and even the entire human race to victory, Duke Marcus. The guard captain continued to persuade her, "Your Highness." The horde's attack was too fast and Alterac was defeated too quickly. They couldn't even form a decent line of defense. Sir Marcus is not a god. He can't create so many troops out of thin air to save Lordaeron. His Majesty's vanguard will take at least a day to arrive. No, he'll come. Even if he's alone, he'll come. He's the hero of the alliance. He's saved countless people who were persecuted by the horde. He'll definitely come to save Lordaeron. Save? Kalia wanted to say, "Save me," but when the words came to her mouth she suddenly realized that there was nothing between her and Duque. Ever since that meeting the two of them had not communicated at all. And what made her even more depressed was that Duque seemed to be infatuated with a female high elf ranger general. The captain seemed to want to say something, but was interrupted by Kalia. "Say no more. My brother is still fighting on the city wall. I won't run away alone. If destruction is the fate of Lordaeron, the fate of the Menethil royal family, then I will accept it calmly." After Kalia finished speaking in one breath, she bit her lip hard, her beautiful blue eyes staring into the distance, quietly waiting for a miracle to happen. Everyone could see that Princess Kalia was close to being possessed. She was madly infatuated with Duque, who had a halo of miracles. That absolute obsession had sublimated into a kind of blind obedience, a kind of faith. This kind of fanatic behavior was the biggest headache for the guards. The guard captain suddenly pointed at the black dot in the distant sky. "Excuse me, Your Highness. Even if we have to tie you up, we will send you safely away. Look, the horde's wyverns are almost here. When they arrive, we have no confidence in sending you away." Kalia suddenly shouted and everyone could hear the ecstasy in her voice. "No, open your eyes. Those are griffins. Not wyverns. Can't you tell the difference between red and white?" The guard captain looked in shock at the black dot that covered the southeast lakeside and rushed towards them at high speed. A few seconds ago it was still a black dot, but a few seconds later he could see faint white wings vibrating. Yes, it was indeed a griffin. The horde's wyverns were all red dragons and there were no white-winged flying mounts. They really came? At this most critical moment. Chapter 432. The city could not be defended. Without reinforcements, they could only unleash 50% of their 100 combat power unless they were destined to be massacred. However, it was different with reinforcements. They could unleash 200% of their combat power. Duque was here. He really came. With an army of nearly 1,000 griffins. Before the griffins arrived, Duque moved. A series of flashing lights appeared in the air. The lights were so short and continuous that they left a long and huge arc in people's eyes. It went straight from the sky to the east gate of Rotterdam. At this moment, when Rotterdam, the core of the alliance, was about to fall, Duque arrived. There was a loud sound in the sky and Duque made his appearance. The water elements in the air were gathering at a high speed, and the water in the moat was rising. Under the gaze of tens of thousands of orc and human warriors, Duque gathered a large amount of water and poured it into the entire city gate in just a few seconds. In just an instant, the city gate that was already open was completely blocked by a huge block of ice. "Orgrim, have you asked for my permission before attacking Rotterdam?" A loud shout, amplified by magic, penetrated the entire orc formation and reached far away. Standing proudly on the city wall, Duque's mage robe fluttered in the bloody wind. His iconic hand of magic covered the entire sky above the east gate, and countless tricolored frostfire arcane missiles rained down on every orc's head. The soldiers of Rotterdam were often fighting a bloody battle just a moment ago, but in the next instant, they were shocked to find that the fierce and powerful enemies in front of them had already been blasted in half by a terrifyingly accurate magic spell. All of a sudden, with the East Gate as the center, the orcs within 200 meters were emptied. After a short moment of shock, the entire city wall immediately burst into thunderous cheers. Long live the Alliance! Long live Lord Marcus! God bless Rotterdam! At this moment, Arthas, who was retreating to the palace under the cover of the royal guards, suddenly realized that the situation behind him had changed. The city gate at the end of the long street was blocked by a huge translucent block of ice. Arthas turned around just in time to see the horde that had just charged into the city being instantly killed by a gorgeous magic. Countless white hands of magic rained down from the sky. The only one who could do this was the legendary vice-commander of the Alliance, Duke Marcus, who had inherited the title of Hundred-Handed Reaper from his master. Looking at the magnificent magic attacks and the dwarf griffin knights hovering above the city walls and killing the horde with their thunder hammers, Arthas suddenly felt ridiculous. If I knew this would happen, I wouldn't have run. The griffin flew towards a tall tower near the city walls. When it almost stopped, an agile elven ranger jumped down from the griffin's back and stood on top of the tower, raining down arrows outside the city. The extraordinary archery skills of the elven rangers were on full display at this moment. They could shoot arrows with a long parabola just by feeling, and with the help of the tower they could extend the range to more than 200 meters. The griffin knights that flew back to the battlefield did not use their usual trick of letting the griffin swoop down to kill the orcs. Instead, they dropped a large number of strangely shaped metal objects. These large bombs produced by the goblins were more lethal than iron grenades. Once they were hit by an impact, they would immediately explode violently. The battlefield was suddenly filled with explosions, and corpses and broken limbs were everywhere. Watching this scene from afar, Orgrim's face turned green again. Duque was definitely the only one who could make the great chief's brown-red face turn green again and again. Duque, Marcus, to Orgrim, to the entire horde, this name was almost a nightmare. No, not a nightmare, but a terrifying existence that had been upgraded to a curse. Again and again. Again and again. Every time the horde saw the hope of complete victory, there would always be Duque or Duque's creation to stop the horde from achieving complete victory. It was impossible for Duque to be like the gods of legend, leaving his avatars in every corner of the world at the same time. On every battlefield there were legends about Duque. His stratagems, his commanders, the strange but effective mechanical creations he invented, they almost always restrained the horde's offensive. Orgrim could not help but wonder if the heavens had specially sent Duque to deal with their horde. If there was no Duque, the horde would have conquered half of the world of Azeroth. On the other side, on the balcony of the palace tower, the maids who had just exclaimed were silent. The royal guards standing at the side were dumbfounded. Everyone looked at Princess Kalia, who was shouting on the balcony in a daze. Holy light above. It's Duque. Oh, my hero. He has come to save me. He has come to save the entire Lordaeron city. Duque, laughing and shouting, Princess Kalia, who was usually gentle, virtuous, and so dignified that she could be called the model of a lady in the entire Lordaeron, was at this moment venting the grievances and fear in her heart. Every young girl had the dream of a prince on a white horse. The brutal orcs had attacked. When her father was not around, when there was no minister or general around her that she could rely on, when her young brother could not stop the enemy's invasion, when she was already pessimistic and desperate, ready to die for her country, Duque had come. Riding on a pure white griffin. A beautiful, majestic, and legendary griffin. Just as she had prayed and hoped for, Duque had come at the most crucial moment. As a savior, he had used his supreme magic to save Lordaeron City. Kalia could not describe the ecstasy and excitement in her heart. She only knew that the fanatical worship had ignited every cell in her body. She only knew that her soul would be branded with Duque's name from now on. She kept shouting Duque's name loudly, like a fanatic worshipping a god, willing to burn her life for him. After slightly repelling the horde, Duque suddenly appeared in front of the stunned Prince Arthas with a few flashes. The guards instinctively got into a fighting stance, and when they saw Duque's alliance emblem, they immediately breathed a sigh of relief. "Are you Prince Arthas Menethil?" I am the Alliance's deputy commander, Duke Marcus. Arthas wanted to take a good look at this legendary figure of the Alliance, who looked to be slightly shorter than him and only a few years older than him. But he knew that the military situation was urgent and quickly said, I am Arthas. Does the deputy commander have any orders? The situation is urgent. I need your highness's authorization to open the teleportation circle in the east of Lordaeron City, as well as the control of all the magic towers in the entire eastern city. Chapter 433. Arthas froze for a moment before remembering something that infuriated him. Because the elite team of mages sent to Alterac had been annihilated, the entire Lordaeron couldn't find a single team of mages to activate the magic defense tower in the city. If they had the protection of the magic tower, how could the Horde have attacked the city so easily? Those things could be settled later. The most important thing now was to kill the Horde. Arthas was never lacking in decisiveness. He took off his necklace and passed it to Duque. Show this to any court wizard, and they will know that it is the decree of the Menethil royal family. Press it on the magic formation, and you will gain control of any teleportation formation or magic tower outside of the city. Thank you, Your Highness. Duque left in a flash. Seeing a series of flashes of light, and in a few seconds he reached the teleportation formation hundreds of meters away. Arthas suddenly felt a sense of longing. It would be wonderful if Duque was his vassal. Arthas's ambition was destined to never come true. The young Arthas did not know how unreliable this transmigrator Duque was. In any case, at this moment, saving Lordaeron was the top priority. Actually, Duque also wanted to curse. It was not that he had not asked Tyrrhena's for the control of the teleportation formation, so that his reinforcements could arrive earlier. King Tyrrhena's refused, citing the unanimous opposition of the court wizards around him. Their thoughts were understandable. A national treasure could not be easily lent to someone else. Once the control of the teleportation formation was lent, who knew if there would be a backdoor in the future? Moreover, the teleportation formation was not something that just anyone could play with. Generally speaking, a Morning Star wizard who was more familiar with spatial magic could guarantee that nothing would happen when they teleported to a city with a teleportation formation. If one was not at the level of a Radiant Moon wizard, they would not have absolute confidence that the teleportation formation they created would be a success. They would not teleport a living person and the other side would receive something that did not look like a human. Teleportation formations were mostly used between main cities, and the material costs were astronomical. They would not be used unless it was absolutely necessary. That was why Tyrrhena's did not teleport many wizards back. Now the situation was very different. The city was about to be breached and there was no need to keep it a secret. If they were to continue hiding, they would just have to wait for the orcs to regroup and attack and then be slaughtered by the Horde. When Duque appeared near the portal and saw the necklace Duque took out, the captain and the court mage heaved a sigh of relief. It seemed that they had already discussed the problem of the portal. Obviously, handing it over to Duque was the most ideal choice. Duque did not argue and quickly took control of the portal. Of course, Duque's work was definitely different from that of an ordinary mage. No mage could be like Duque, who secretly made a copy of the teleportation portal and all the spatial coordinates of the entire Rotterdam city while activating the authority of the portal. In the name of Menethil, open the portal. The soldiers of the Rotterdam kingdom were shocked to discover that several teleportation portals near the eastern city wall had suddenly opened, and a large number of elves were rushing out of the blue and white illusory teleportation portals. Not only were there many rangers with longbows and at least 3 quivers on their backs, but there were also a few infantrymen and mages in long robes. Apart from Duque, if anyone could control the situation, they would realize that the number of elven wizards in Rotterdam City had exceeded 500. The organization of high elven wizards was completely different from that of human wizards. For human wizards, a sky wizard was usually the captain, and the ones leading them were mostly morning stars. After all, a Radiant Moon wizard was usually the chief court mage of a certain palace. When the battle was at its most intense, the mages under the command of the wizards would even be assigned apprentices who could only cast fireballs to make up the numbers. The high elven wizards, sky wizards, usually took up half of the high elven wizards, while the remaining 40% were earth wizards and 10% were morning stars. The ones leading them were definitely Radiant Moon wizards. On the surface, the Dalajan had 8 Radiant Moons while Kuel Salis had 50. Fortunately, in terms of military strength, both Kuel Salas and the Dalajan only had one Breaking Dawn wizard each. Otherwise, the Dalajan wizards would have to bow their heads in submission. When the teleportation gate next to Duque opened, a female elven wizard with a hot figure and a robe with very little fabric walked out first, followed by 2 elven rangers that Duque recognized. Then came the other soldiers, rangers and wizards. Esteemed Vice Commander Marcus of the Rotterdam Alliance, Marion Firewing, the leader of the first wizard group of the Kuel Salas frontline army of the Rotterdam Alliance, pays my respects to you. The radiant moon elven wizard's robe had very little fabric, and Duque retracted his gaze after a single glance. Damn it! This robe was almost comparable to the insight magic robe that Duque had worn before he transmigrated. It had a high slit on the legs and a heart-shaped hollowness on the chest. Did you come to fight a war or catch a rich man? The other 2 fellows were much more pleasing to the eye. In fact, they could be considered old friends. Brigadier General Rose Selma Theron and her subordinates reporting to Sir Marcus. Brigadier General Haduran Brightwing reporting to Sir Marcus. Duque keenly noticed that these 2 who had been Silveryman's big 3 in his previous life, had now been promoted to generals. This was the result of him poaching Aurelia and Queen Sylvanas in advance. In order to fulfill the alliance, Kuel Salas had to send out the wizard group and rangers. The rangers who had not been valued in the past had now become the main force. The high elves were proud. Even though they had almost knelt before and their army had been beaten like dogs, they were still unwilling to bow their heads in front of humans. They were still unwilling to lower their heads in front of humans, so it was a blessing in disguise that Rose Selma and Haduran had not followed the Windrunner family's rangers. Without further ado, Generals Theron and Brightwing, please have your people quickly occupy all the tall towers. I want you to push the beastmen back. Understood. The 2 future big leaders quickly led their people away. What about me? Marion winked at Duque flirtatiously. Even though Marion had deliberately downplayed her status as a Silvery Moon counselor and even used honorifics with him as a Radiant Moon wizard, Duque could tell at a glance that for some reason she wanted to get close to him. Duque ignored the heat in front of him. Sir Firewing, I've already opened up control of the magic tower to your people. I need you and your people to build an ice defense line along the moat. The most important thing now is to stabilize it. Understood. Marion was quite smart. At least she would not waste Duque's time at a time like this. Chapter 434. A few minutes later, the dozens of mage towers standing near the eastern city wall released a cold wind at the same time. This cold wind suddenly blew across the moat, and in just a few seconds, more than 5 kilometers of the eastern moat was completely frozen. The orcs who were dripping in the moat were instantly killed. They suddenly realized that the more they walked, the slower and colder it became. Originally, the water pressure did not feel anything, but now the strong pressure was squeezing their chests, forcing out every breath of air from their lungs. Uncomfortable, cold, and hopeless. At least 2,000 orcs were frozen to death in the frozen moat. Standing in the tallest mage tower, Marion of the Silver Moon Parliament looked at the mage tower in front of her with a little disdain. Only a 100% increase. Forget it, it's better than nothing. I can't expect anything good to come out of this barren magic civilization. After talking to herself, Marion smiled coldly and immediately contacted all her subordinates with magic. In the name of Qual Dorii, Frozen Forest. In the magic communication network, the voices of hundreds and thousands of high elf mages sounded at the same time. In the name of Qual Dorii. In the next moment, all the mage towers in the eastern part of the entire Lordaeron kingdom moved. The spire of the mage tower near the palace was the first to emit a soft white light. The atmosphere was vibrating and white frost elements could be seen condensing into light spots the size of snowflakes, quickly gathering on the various mage towers. Many grains of sand formed a tower. Water gathered to form a river. Rivers flowed into the sea. The mage towers violently extracted the water elements of the entire city, and then used a visible beam of light to transmit the water elements to the mage towers near the city wall. Princess Kalia, who was standing on the balcony, was surprised to see a huge white network forming in the sky above the entire eastern city. Looked like a huge spiderweb. Gather. Sublimate. Seeing so many mage towers emitting white light outside the city, Orgrim instinctively shouted, "Ghoul, Dan." What answered him were the stunned expressions of the guards around him as well as the lonely sound of the wind. Right. Ghoul, Dan was not here. The Shadow Council Warlock group and the twin-headed Ogre Sorcerer group, the only two groups of the Horde that could fight against the Alliance Sorcerer group, were not here. The former had been destroyed by Orgrim and the latter. The Ogre magicians who should have gathered here a long time ago weren't here either. Orgrim had a bad feeling about this. At this moment he could only grit his teeth and watch as the warriors of the Blackrock tribe used their flesh and blood to withstand the terrifying magic that was about to descend. It was only at times like this that Orgrim could truly feel the importance of the warlocks and mages of the Horde that he loved and hated. It was too late. Frozen Forest was activated. In the entire defensive line, the moat was an important link. The moat, dug along the edge of the city and channeled water from Lake Lordamere, suddenly turned on the orcs. Countless translucent, ice-cold crystal clusters arched their spines in the moat that stretched for miles like ice hedgehogs. The icicles pierced through the countless orc warriors who were killing wantonly a moment ago, unleashing their savagery and violence. Their thick armor could not stop the icicles' sharpness. Their bodies, which had not completely lost their lives, trembled and convulsed on the icicles. The next moment almost everyone on the defensive line saw the frozen forest, which looked like a torture rack, turning the entire defensive line into a crystal-clear, cruel work of art. Everywhere was blood red. The orcs were all stunned. Lordamere had simply put on a hedgehog shell that was armed to the teeth. This wasn't the end. Hadron Brightwing and Theron raced their longbows high in the air. They knocked their arrows and two rays of green light drew beautiful arcs in the sky. A second later, the sound of bowstrings vibrating could be heard from all the towers in the city. All the soldiers of Lordamere who were stunned at the top of the city wall saw a black cloud rising at high speed into the sky, turning the sky black. Then the black cloud stopped at the highest point and poured down. Unlike humans who used the density of arrows to make up for their lack of accuracy, this black cloud was actually a combination of accurate shooting and wide-area shooting. Under Duque's insistence, the Elven Rangers used steel arrowheads made by the bronze-bearded dwarves from Iron Stove Castle. After the Rangers spent a few days getting used to it, their damage was greatly increased. Many orcs could be seen to have their vitals pierced even after making dodging and blocking movements. For example, one orc had used his arm to cover his face and throat, but a steel arrow pierced through his helmet from the side, straight into his temple and killed him. Both sides were stunned. Within 30 meters of the moat, there was not a single orc alive. Or not attack. This was a serious question. We can't retreat. We must attack. If we missed today, we might not have the chance to take down the core capital of the Alliance so easily in the future. Orgrim roared. His plan was right. He had finally found a chance to deal a heavy blow to the core kingdom of the Alliance. He could not give it up just like that. After the brief ecstasy of destroying Alterac, Orgrim finally realized that he had to destroy the will of the humans, elves and dwarves to resist. The 10 countries of the Alliance, 7 human kingdoms, 2 dwarven kingdoms and a high elf. Today the Horde did not have the absolute upper hand in terms of combat power. A protracted war was something the Horde did not want to see. The Horde was rapidly weakening. Orgrim knew that if they could not defeat the Alliance within this year and turn the battle into a war of annihilation, the Horde would most likely be counterattacked and lose all the territory they had conquered. Orgrim gave Samuro a look, then waved his hand at the 2 troll chiefs. Immediately, the trolls and the sword sages of the Fireblade clan pressed forward. The trolls and elves had been fighting for thousands of years and knew each other very well. The trolls would never lose to the Elven Rangers. Under the cover of hundreds of orc warriors with human tower shields, thousands of trolls approached the city walls fearlessly and started shooting at the Elven Rangers. The powerful and heavy javelins shot towards the tower with a momentum that almost defied gravity. Even if they missed, the javelins would still cause rocks to fly everywhere when they hit the top of the tower. The Elven Rangers had no choice but to dodge and used the shooting holes of the human towers to retaliate against the trolls. This way, their field of vision and shooting were severely affected. At the same time, the agile sword sages leaped up the city walls through the gaps in the ice crystal forest, crossed the city walls, and aimed at the elven mages in the mage towers. Chapter 435. Even though each mage tower had a small team of elven guards and 2 to 3 rangers protecting the mages inside, there were still more than 10 mage towers that were attacked. There were even 2 or 3 mage towers that had all the mages inside killed in battle. However, after losing the invisibility effect and the wind steps skill could not be used continuously, the rangers started a fierce battle with the sword saints. Samuro's goal was to kill Duque. Only by killing this human who had obstructed the Horde's victory time and time again could he completely turn the tide of the battle between the Alliance and the Horde. The general trend of history could not be changed by the will of man. The power of a great man could not be replicated. The judgment and decision of a great leader was definitely the main factor that led the entire organization to success or decline. Perhaps assassination was despicable. However, our world was being destroyed. For the orcs' way out and to win this race war, Samuro felt that he was duty-bound. He also knew that this was a very, very risky move, but his warrior's blood was stimulating him. The rapid secretion of adrenaline in his body made him fall into a very excited state. His heart was beating faster and every blood vessel in his body was circulating at a high speed. However, his mind was blank. He pounced at Duque, who was on a mage tower at high speed. When he saw Duque, who was originally looking into the distance expressionlessly, suddenly looking at him and his team of sword saints, a cruel and cold smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. It was the smile of a hunter looking at his prey. Not good. Duque was prepared. That's right. From the moment Samuro killed Eden Pyreus, Duque was determined to kill Samuro and the sword saints of the Fireblade clan. One could be a thief for 1,000 days but not a thief for 1,000 days. Apart from the disgusting undead clan, there was only one Duque in the world who could be resurrected. The other important members, even Lothar, who was the best at fighting, did not dare to say that he could definitely dodge Samuro's sneak attack. The other Fireblade sword saints were easy to deal with, but Samuro had to die. He had the highest tier of Gale Steps and Fatal Strike skills, and he had a wealth of battle experience. If he couldn't assassinate him, he would fight him head-on. If he couldn't defeat him head-on, he would run. Who else would he kill if he didn't? These were the key reasons why Samuro had become Duque's must-kill target. Around Duque there were also a large number of demon spirits. Different from ordinary demons and spirits, these demons and spirits were disguised as all kinds of things, be it stones or scattered supplies. They were all the most common things on the battlefield. They did not sound the alarm directly, but were directly connected to Duque's system. In front of so many demon spirits, Samuro and his sword saint team have nowhere to hide. Have you finished writing your will? Samuro. Along with Duque's cold voice, Duque suddenly put his hands together and clenched his opened fingers into a fist. Immediately, a raging flame rose from Samuro's feet. The sound of the explosion resounded on the long street. Of course, the invisibility was immediately broken. Including Samuro, 3 of the 9 sacred swordsmen were blasted away and turned into a pile of charred meat in midair as they couldn't withstand the violent explosion. The remaining 6 were mostly covered in dust. Only Samuro was in a better condition, but he was also battered and exhausted. Let's go, Samuro shouted to the remaining sword saints. Sword saints were not suitable for the harsh environment and the battlefield with wide area continuous damage. The price of overpolarizing attack power, speed and dodging ability was that their physique was relatively weak. They were not like most beastmen who were born with a certain amount of elemental resistance. As for magic damage, they would take it all in. What made Samuro most uneasy was that there were huge ice walls rising from all directions at the same time. In the blink of an eye, they had grown from one person's height to 2 people's height. Furthermore, they were rapidly closing in the middle. This was to create a huge ice cover to trap all the sword saints. Ha! Samuro let out a beast-like roar. He was the first to brandish a ball of sword light to protect himself. Then he charged out like an arrow. At the same time, there were at least 5 green figures pouncing over from outside. Dang 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 dang. The continuous sounds of weapons clashing converged into one. 2 sword saints turned into corpses and fell from the sky. 3 sword saints were knocked back. After Samuro and a slender figure exchanged 13 attacks in a split second, both of them flew backwards. Samuro returned to the range of the ice barrier, while the other party flew 3 body lengths backwards in the air. Her pretty face was flushed. But when Samuro raised his head, he realized that the ice cover was actually less than 10 feet away from closing. He could now clearly see his opponent. It was a silver-haired female high elf who looked very beautiful from a human's point of view. Her skills and talent were not bad, but her aura was still lacking. The two female high elves who had just killed his two subordinates also pounced at him again. Samuro had a faint premonition that this was his last attack. If he failed, he would lose his last chance to escape. In reality, that was exactly the case. The four Windrunner sisters Hadron and Lore Thema, especially the last two, had been dragged here by Duque after the first round of attacks. It was not an exaggeration to say that the 6 strongest rangers in the world were all here just to ambush Samuro. This showed how important Duque was to Samuro. The one who exchanged blows with Samuro was Sasha. She was at a disadvantage by half a move, but it created an opportunity for Aurelia and Cervantes to attack again. The two slender figures were about to fight with Samuro. Samuro gritted his teeth and directly activated Blade Storm. The 6 figures dodged again. They surrounded Samuro but did not approach him at all, allowing Samuro to vent his anger into the air. Blade Storm could not be stopped just because he wanted it to. The price of an attack that could destroy the heavens and the earth was that one's movement would slow down and the exhaustion after the big move. Duque was not annoyed. He leisurely gathered an ice ball the size of a carriage and threw it over. "Aren't you very good at shaving ice? So what if you cut some shaved ice for me?" Duque mocked. It was fine for Aurelia as she held it in. Sasha, who had a low threshold for laughter, burst out laughing. The 6 high elf ranger heroes stood in 6 different directions and stared at Samuro. At this moment, Samuro was like a clown dancing in the enemy's cage. It was laughable and pathetic. He was not willing. He was not willing. He knew that the chances of escaping and winning were very slim. He still entered the invisibility state of wind step. The moment Blade Storm stopped. He wanted to give a final blow to Duque, no any high elf warrior present. Chapter 436. Unfortunately, Samuro was hit. 6 flares shot out in an instant, teaching him and the sword saint who followed him a lesson. Flares. A common skill of hunters and rangers. This wasn't a skill that could bring out thieves and sword saints who were in stealth with a light bullet that emitted light and heat. It had nothing to do with science or physics. Flares contained the extension of the ranger's willpower. Was there something distorting the light? Was there an invisible creature expelling the air? Everything became visible under the flares that condensed the ranger's willpower. That was why hunters and rangers could only use 1 flare at a time. Now 6 top rangers were shooting flares at the same time. If there were 2 less, Samuro might still have a chance to escape. Unfortunately, there were 6 of them covering all directions. Samuro was immediately illuminated. The moment the burly green figure was illuminated, Samuro stopped moving. His muscles were still strong and full of strength. His body still looked extremely strong, but everyone knew that he was weak. He was the hero in the eyes of the tribe, the thorn in the flesh of the alliance, the nightmare of the kings. Unfortunately, all of Samuro's fame would become history in a while. Humph. The sword saint who had been beaten back into the ice shield let out the last groan of his life. In order not to affect Samuro's last chance to escape as the new chief of the Fire Blade clan, they would try their best not to disturb Samuro even if they had to die. In the end, a teardrop from his left eye tore open Samuro's determined face. Without any words, he ignored the 6 elven ranger heroes who were ready to make a move and just looked up at Duque, who was on top of the mage tower. Duque sighed. He admired Samuro's courage. It had nothing to do with the camp, but purely because of Samuro's spirit. Unfortunately, admiration was admiration and understanding was understanding. This didn't mean that Duque was going to give up his position as a human and lick the boots of a tribe's hero. The enemy's hero, my enemies. Duque didn't say anything either. With a knife-hand posture, he slammed down heavily. Loktar Ogre. He would rather die than win. The resonant roar was the epitaph of the orc sacred swordsman hero, Samuro. On the other side, Orgrim took advantage of the fact that the trolls and orc sword saints were temporarily suppressing the long-range attackers on top of the city walls. More orcs surged forward, violently smashing all the protruding icicles with their giant warhammers. Then, ignoring the dwarf griffin knights that frequently flew across the sky to launch surprise attacks, they stepped on the corpses of their fellow orcs and launched an even more ferocious attack on the wall. Arthes, who had just left the city wall, returned to the city wall under the escort of the guards. Although he was not at the front line, his appearance still greatly encouraged the soldiers. At the same time, the generals and their soldiers who had rushed over from all over the city had also replenished the defensive line. Warriors of the Rotterdam, raise your weapons and make those despicable orcs regret having the audacity to invade our homeland. Arthes, who was not far behind Arthes, raised his two-handed greatsword. Duque felt like he was looking at the Lich King who would raise Frostmourne in the future. Arthas's face flushed with excitement and nervousness when he saw Duke's arrival. Deputy Commander-in-Chief, Rotterdam needs more reinforcements, he said. Duque bowed lightly. As you wish, Your Highness. Orgrim roared angrily from the horde. Where are the ogres? Are they not here yet? How many more are behind us? The ogres are too slow. They are still stuck on the mountain path, Zulucid replied. You know that other than the twin-headed ogre mage, no one can command those idiots better. Then what about our men? The mountain path is too narrow. We have at least 2 clans behind us. When the horde counted the number of people in the army, they would usually use the large clans as a unit. A single clan would mean 10,000 people. Tell them to hurry up. In order to maximize the effect of the surprise attack, Orgrim ordered the vanguard to attack as soon as they left the mountain. In fact, without Duque, the horde would have already invaded Rotterdam and entered a meat grinder. At this moment, 3 bright red flares were shot into the sky. The bad premonition in Orgrim's heart grew stronger by the second. At the far end of the battlefield, near the lake between Lake Rotterdam and the Alterac Mountains, a huge cloud of dust suddenly appeared. The sound of horse hooves piercing through the clouds shook the entire battlefield. To be honest, due to the terrain, the horde did not have many opportunities to fight against the human cavalry. However, this did not mean that Orgrim did not know how terrifying the cavalry was. During the first battle in the Elven Forest, the warriors of the horde had also encountered the cavalry. The scale of the cavalry was not large, and in Orgrim's eyes, it was the only army that the humans could fight against the orc infantry. Not good. Orgrim cried out in shock. The timing of the cavalry's arrival was too cruel. It was the exact moment when the horde could not spare any strength to attack. On the southeast side of the lake, 3 huge flags were fluttering in the wind. The Alterac Mountain Eagle flag with an orange background. The Highland Knights flag with a red background. The Golden Lion flag of Stormwind with a blue background. No one would have thought that long before the fall of Alterac, Duque had already transferred the Highland Knights and the Royal Knights of Stormwind here. Now, after joining General Haas's Eagle Knights, there were as many as 2,500 knights and 7,000 cavalrymen gathered at the lakeside. They rode their horses to the battlefield from their hiding place and quickly spread out their formation. The 3 generals stepped out. For the fall of Alterac, General Haas closed his visor. For the blood debt of the earthy highlands, King Salas Tolbane held his lance. For the destruction of Stormwind City and the wrath of the kingdom, King Langrin raised his sword high. Charge! Bolvar Fordragon took the lead and opened the way. He was like a spear holding his war hammer in front of him. He stabbed his horse with a spur and in pain the horse charged at the orc army at high speed. Most of the orcs were focused on the city wall. The white wall was unexpectedly strong, and only a few dents appeared under their fierce attacks. Only a few of the orcs heard Orgrim's command and turned around to stop the horsemen and riders from advancing. Chapter 437. In a frontal assault, there were not many troops that could match the beastmen's infantry. The beastmen, who were taller than their horses, did not fear the human cavalry at all. As long as they avoided the first wave of spears, then even if the humans and their warhorses charged forward, the chances of both sides killing each other would be 50-50. But now it was the human cavalry that was charging at the rear. Orgrim could almost foresee that a tragedy was about to unfold. Bolvar's warhorse panted heavily, its 4 hooves trampling on the ground seeming incomparably heavy. Of course, when one of the beastmen turned around to look, his mouth opened wide in shock. What did he see? A skewer of beastmen. Bolvar relied on his unscientific power of holy light to directly transform into a Xianxia. One had to know that the middle part of a lance was made with a fragile and easily broken spear. This was to prevent the powerful recoil from knocking the knight off his horse after stabbing the enemy. However, with the infusion of holy light, the lance that should have broken on its own was turned into a steel spear by Bolvar. He pierced through 3 beastmen in one go, and continued to rely on his powerful momentum and holy light to charge into the enemy formation. 3-4-5. In the end, 7 beastmen were stabbed to death by Bolvar's specially lengthened 6-meter lance. Only when the 7th beastman was pierced did Bolvar let go of the lance that had finally exploded, leaving the bunch of beastmen to struggle on the ground. The moment he let go, Bolvar accurately grabbed the warhammer that was tied to the right side of his saddle. Before touching the next enemy, the huge warhammer had already spun in a circle in the air. One of the beastmen opened his mouth, not knowing if he was about to warn his companion or roar, but Bolvar's warhammer easily smashed his lower jaw like a polo ball. This strike had also broken his neck at the same time. The beastman flew backwards and fell in front of Bolvar. Bolvar rode on his warhorse and trampled over him. Behind him were the knights galloping on their horses. The reason why knights were a few levels higher than cavalry was because a qualified knight had to go through at least 5 years of training. From noble etiquette to knight's creed, from horsemanship, spear skills to swordsmanship, all sorts of combat skills were nurtured. It was not an exaggeration to say that the effort needed to nurture a qualified knight was enough to nurture 100 cavalry. It was precisely because the elites of the 3 countries had gathered together that they were able to gather so many knights. Almost every knight had gained something from the first round of attacks. They perfectly cut a huge hole in the orc formation, and the cavalry behind them waved their long swords and warhammers, further increasing the chaos among the orcs. The entire orc rear army was cut into pieces by the cavalry of the 3 kingdoms. Following closely behind the cavalry was the infantry. Compared to the magnificent formation of the cavalry, the infantry was a little lacking. 20,000 Storm King cavalrymen were already all of them. These were infantrymen who had been baptized by the flames of war. They fiercely swept through the scattered beastmen and stabbed the beastmen who turned their heads towards them to death. They followed the footsteps of the cavalry and attempted to quickly cross the entire battlefield and rush to the northeast of Rotterdam. Stop them. We just need to enter the chaotic battle. It was one thing for the cavalry to break through their formation, but they actually wanted to use infantry to circle around the rear? Orgrim was so angry that he wanted to laugh. At this moment, the ballistae in the city were fired. Arrows and boulders rained down on the front of the orc army that had become densely packed. Haas, Lang and Salas led their cavalry to break through the entire orc army's rear army and split them up perfectly. After breaking through the formation, they split into 3, made the smallest circle and once again attacked the rear army from another flaw, turning the entire rear army upside down. There was not a single organized orc army that could pose a sufficient threat to the charging human infantry. The orcs were in chaos and did not know what to do. But when they faced the city wall, the Alliance army attacked them from the rear, and when they turned their heads towards the cavalry, they were attacked by the city guards. They had not broken through the city wall yet, so they could not retreat into the city. If they continued fighting like this, they would only be bleeding in the chaos. Orgrim was inexplicably shocked. This was simply beyond all the military knowledge of the orcs. Why could the human cavalry find the weakest point of the orcs in the midst of a fierce battle and attack it? Why did they not attack the seemingly weak points of the elite orcs that were lying in ambush? On the tower of Lordaeron, Arthas looked at Duque, who was giving orders beside him, in shock. Magic communication was only suitable for fixed-point communication. When moving, there was no spatial positioning, so there was no way to receive the message. Duque had a better idea. Let Lang turn left 30 degrees and kill his way through the slightly dirt-colored army. That's the second-rate Iron Sand clan of the Horde. Salas, you're charging too hard. Damn it, you're the king. Even though Duque was fiercely complaining, the 2 beautiful elven rangers beside Duque, one with gold hair and the other with silver hair, still used their beautiful voices to transmit Duque's words. General Hadron explained to Prince Arthas, "That's Whisper of the Wind, a skill unique to the Windrunner family. It can transmit one's voice with the wind and reach a specific person's ears within a few miles. So powerful. Then can I hire some elves who know, Whisper of the Wind, to be my vassals? Hadron's face was full of embarrassment. I'm sorry, but there are currently only 4 windrunners who know this skill, and they're all direct vassals of Lord Marcus. I see. Arthas's face was full of regret. At this time the situation of the battle changed again. After the Alliance's cavalry attacked the orcs' rear, they returned to the vicinity of the lake, and the city's defenses were activated once more. Even though the continuous attacks made the orcs lose their bearings, they were unfortunately not many, but they were extremely elite. A row of orcs with the strongest physiques charged in the direction of Salas's Highland Knights. Salas was more cautious and he charged towards the right side of the line of soldiers. The result of the cavalry's charge shocked Salas. After losing their lances, the cavalry no longer had any mid-range or long-range weapons. Normally, no one would be willing to collide with a galloping warhorse. Obviously, these 8-foot-tall orcs were an exception. Regardless of whether they chopped down or swung up, their huge warhammers could disregard the nearly 1-ton weight of the riders and their horses, and the terrifying force of the impact. In an instant, both riders and horses were sent flying. Chapter 438. Only a few horsemen like Salas, who were skilled in horsemanship, were able to dodge the fatal blow and fight back. The cavalrymen's charge took down a lot of orcs, but they were immediately replaced by new warriors. The orcs lined up neatly in 3 rows and began to advance towards the Alliance cavalry, forcing them to retreat. Step by step they forced them towards the lake. Although these orcs only had 3 thin layers, the quality of their individual soldiers was enough to crush the terrifying foundation of the Alliance cavalry. Even if it was just 3 rows, the Alliance cavalry would not be able to break through it. The rear began to stabilize, and the Alliance infantry was also fiercely attacked by the orcs from the center. For a moment, it was as if they were in a quagmire. Once they achieved their goal, half of the remaining orc soldiers continued to attack the city. They crossed the ice crystal forest and attacked the city wall fiercely. Soon they used up the stones, boiling oil, sand, and other things that could be used for defense. Now the orcs could safely continue to climb the city wall. The orcs climbed over the city wall with evil smiles and tried to climb as much as possible. Most of the orcs were pierced or shot down by the elven rangers before they could climb up the city wall, but some still managed to climb up and began to attack the guards. Arthas never thought that the orcs' ant-like siege was so terrifying. They had clearly extinguished the first wave of attacks not long ago, but more orcs surged over. The corpses of the orcs piled up and provided some cover for the orcs as they climbed the wall. They stepped on the corpses of their companions and even used them as shields to resist the continuous rain of arrows and magic attacks that fell from time to time. The orcs' attacks were terrifying. Usually, as long as one orc climbed up the city wall, it would cost the lives of 5 to 6 Lordaeron soldiers to kill it. The defense of the city became precarious again. We can't go on like this. Arthas shouted nervously to Duque. Commander, Lordaeron will collapse first in the afternoon. We need reinforcements. Duque smiled. He touched Arthas's blood-stained helmet like a senior. Your Highness, although I am not much older than you in terms of military affairs, I am your senior. For some reason, Duque's smile gave the impression that Duque was proud of himself. He said in an extremely pretentious manner, a true king or commander never defeats his enemies on the battlefield. What? Arthas was stunned. A true commander will gather all the cards needed for victory before the battle begins. The so-called battle is often just a formality. Ha! At this moment, Duque's body was filled with an unparalleled aura. The mysterious and confident aura that lingered around him made everyone around him feel that as long as Duque pointed his finger, even if there were thousands of tribes, even if it was a cruel army that had destroyed several countries and was known as the nightmare of the human world, they would be reduced to ashes in an instant. Arthas was momentarily stunned. Hadron Brightwing and Theron, the 2 newly promoted ranger generals, froze on the spot. Beside Duque, Aurelia and Sasha's breathing quickened. Everyone stared at Duque's actions. They saw him proudly raise his left index finger and point it towards the northeast horizon. Following the direction of Duque's finger, a huge flag appeared. Rows of silver-helmeted and armored infantrymen walked out of the horizon. Behind them was the sun, making them look like an army that had walked out of the Age of Legends. The raised spears were like a forest, the tips of the spears reflecting the dazzling sunlight. For some reason, every soldier thought of the era when humans were united under a single flag for the first time in history. It awakened a distant legend that had been passed down from their ancestors for more than 2,800 years. That was an era when all human clans fought side by side. That was a glorious and resplendent era where victory was the end of every battle. That one answer seemed to be branded in the soul, branded in everyone's genes. What was that answer? The Arather Empire. The greatest human empire. At this moment on this battlefield, there was an even greater organization. The Lordaeron Alliance. 1, 2, dozens, hundreds of flags suddenly appeared on the horizon, fluttering in the wind. From the looks of it, there were more than 100,000 of them. The soldiers began to pick up speed, jogging on the battlefield. They held their heads high, their spears raised in rows. A silver-white wave appeared on the battlefield. They were clearly infantrymen, but they gave off a terrifying aura as if there were tens of thousands of galloping horses. These warriors all had distinct human facial features. Everyone looked at them from afar, but because of the sunlight, their faces were covered in a layer of golden light. Their faces became blurry and the weapons in their hands became dazzling. Every face became deified. They seemed to have become an army of heroic spirits that had walked out from the distant past to once again fight for humanity. It's our people. It's our brothers from the Griffin Legion. Reinforcements are here. Long live the Alliance. Every soldier suddenly exploded with greater strength and momentum. The aura that had been suppressed by the Horde rose once again, suppressing the Horde. The redness on Orgrim's face faded. He knew that he had to make a decision. They were at a disadvantage and the Alliance was attacking them from both sides. If he had enough time, he might have been able to surround them and attack the reinforcements. He could have taken out one or two of the Alliance's divisions first. But now the Horde was the one being surrounded. No matter how strong Orgrim's elites were, they only had a little more than 30,000 men. Now that the Alliance's troops had exceeded the Horde's limit, if they continued fighting they might collapse. At that moment, Sulud brought even worse news to Orgrim. Great Chief, there are many warships on the lake in the south, flying the Dalajan and Gilnea's flags. They are less than half a day away from us. I miscalculated. Orgrim's mouth was full of bitterness. Originally, Orgrim dared to attack Lordaeron because he wanted to make use of the time difference. He wanted to take down Lordaeron before the main force returned. In Orgrim's plan, the Lordaeron army should return first, followed by Grom's 100,000 soldiers. The allied forces of Dalaran and Gilneas, who were further south, should be the last to arrive. But now, the Alliance used their original advantage on Lordaeron Lake to mobilize ships to send reinforcements to Lordaeron. If that was the case, the troops in Lordaeron would exceed 200,000 in a day. Even with Grom's troops, they still wouldn't be able to take them down. After thinking for a while, Orgrim finally shouted out the most bitter word he could think of. Retreat. Chapter 439. Before the arrival of the Allied army from the northeast, the tribe retreated like the ebb tide of the sea. They even avoided the Alliance infantrymen who had circled to the rear of the tribe and were nailed there like a mainstay. At this moment, Dooku only lacked a feather fan and a sage-like robe. Then he could go and pretend to be a pig. The smile on his face made him look like he was full of confidence. Even though he was mobilizing troops that he already knew, it was as if he was in control of a magic box that could create an endless army of thousands of men and horses. He was always able to mobilize the most suitable troops at the most crucial time. Orgrim's fierce surprise attack turned into a magnificent ambush under Dooku's command. Just now, even the top of Lordaeron's walls could see the Dalajan and Lordaeron speedboats rushing over from the direction of Lordaeron Lake. Arthas was first pleasantly surprised to find that his hometown and his city had been saved. Then he immediately thought of something. If the Dalajan and Gilneas troops all come here, then what if the tribes of the Silver Pine Forest attack south? That's right. Then what? It was not just Arthas. Several Alliance generals wanted to know the answer to this question. In fact, Dooku really wanted to teach Arthas. The one riding the white horse is not necessarily a prince, it can also be Xuanzang. The one who is a paladin can also become a demon king. But in order not to reveal the secrets of the heavens, Duque pointed to the Alliance's speedboats on the calm lake in the south and teased Arthes. Your Highness, ships flying the Alliance flag are not all Alliance warships. Even if it was a warship, it did not mean that it only carried soldiers. The tribes will only see the Alliance's reinforcements coming, but they will never know that only ships, food and sailors are coming. Be it Arthes or the other generals of the Alliance, all of them were visibly moved. Duque pointed to the huge formation of troops in the northeast. 100,000 troops are not equal to 100,000 elites. The true elites were only the few square formations at the front. The ones behind are just farmers who have been trained for less than 3 weeks. That's right, Duque hadn't conjured the magic lamp of the army. He'd only placed the Griffin Legion in front of him for show. Behind them were the farmers provided by the local nobles of the Rotterdam Kingdom. However, after a period of training, they were at least more or less presentable when marching. When it came to real swords and spears, these guys who had never experienced blood and fire, no matter how bright their armor was, were still cowardly farmers deep down. The young Arthes was astonished. Is that even possible? Why not? Duque combed his sweaty hair. Didn't I mobilize so many troops to save Lordaeron? As long as we can defend today when your father's army arrives, it will be the time for our alliance to encircle and annihilate the 2 orc armies that have penetrated deep into the alliance's hinterland. Arthes' eyes lit up. Duque's well-placed commands, his realistic disguises, and the military arrangements that had fooled even his own people. Duque's method of using his troops was an eye-opener for Arthes. It showed him what it meant to be a commander. The scenes that Arthes had experienced today were like images that had been imprinted on his soul. They had opened doors to a wider world for him, and he felt that he had benefited greatly. Suddenly, Arthes had an impulse. He strode forward and lowered his noble head to Duque. Lord Marcus, can I become your disciple and learn the art of war? Be it Duque or the others, everyone was stunned. The master of the prince of the strongest country on the continent. Sounded so noble. Unfortunately, when he thought of Arthes, who had killed his own father and teacher, Duque felt disgusted, as though he had swallowed a fly alive. Duque didn't reply. He turned his gaze to the distance outside the east gate. There were countless orc corpses as well as the bodies of more than 2,000 civilians lying there quietly. Duque's pupils shrank. He remembered that Lilith had told him about Arthes's order to close the gates. He was not a saint, and he didn't have the ability to save every civilian on the continent. In Duque's eyes, there was no such thing as saving 300,000 people or abandoning 3,000 people. If he had known about the enemy's attack in advance like Arthes, he would have arranged for the civilians to take refuge more safely, instead of waiting for the disaster to befall them before deciding whether to abandon them or not. Before his transmigration, Duque had often heard of an old saying, "Don't do evil because it's small." In history, Arthes had started to fall precisely because he had massacred the citizens of Stratholme, who were about to become zombies for the sake of the bigger picture. Duque had once wondered if Arthes would be different in this life. After all, Arthes was still a teenager, a relatively naive prince. Duque suddenly realized that personality really determined fate. The scene of abandoning 3,000 civilians had nothing to do with the original history, but Arthes still made a similar decision. Too ruthless. The experience of Arthes in history might be worthy of sympathy, but this guy was clearly the template of an ambitious and ruthless person. At this thought, Duque made up his mind. He pointed outside the east gate. A commander can be said to have to make the decision of who to let die at every moment. But the original intention of a commander is to protect the country and the people. And the soldiers who carry out the commander's orders are also willing to give up everything they have. I think your highness should first learn the principles of life and the way of the Holy Light from the Archbishop of Holy Light before learning the way of a commander. After saying that, Duque left without looking back, leaving the generals of Rotterdam and Arthes, who looked as if he had been struck by lightning, in a daze. Of course, there was no need for Duque to clean up the battlefield and count the losses. Duque divided the army into 2 parts. One part was the 20,000 Stormwind infantrymen from Hillsbrad. After the battle there were less than 15,000 of them left. Duke allowed all of them to enter Lordaeron city. The other group came from the northern sentry towers with the Griffin Legion as the core. Together with the remaining 6,000 cavalry, they set up camp in the north of Lordaeron city, forming a triangle with Lordaeron city. The main purpose was to prevent Orgrim's main force from joining forces with Grom Helror's 100,000 orcs. On this day, Orgrim waited for the arrival of the ogres, while the alliance quickly organized the city's defenses and waited for the main force of Rotterdam to return. Finally, on the afternoon of the second day, the alliance waited for Mograine, who had led his army back. When the famous Ashbringer saw the flag of Rotterdam on the city wall, this iron-like man immediately got off his horse and knelt on the ground, weeping and kissing the soil of Rotterdam. Chapter 440. Whose tears were flying. Whose applause was ringing out. For the citizens of Lordaeron who claimed to be the best in the world, yesterday was definitely the most uneasy day. They used to think that war was so far away. The nobles sang and danced as usual. There were still hundreds of banquets and dances every month. Those great nobles would hold 1,000-person masquerade balls and provide hundreds of desserts at banquets. The peaceful thoughts of the nobles were greatly amplified. The citizens naturally enjoyed the peace and prosperity. Yesterday everything changed. The savage orcs broke through the layers of defense, crossed the mountains and killed their way into the city. Even though most of the orcs were killed on the city walls, there were still a few who broke through the defense lines and started killing in the city. The strongest troops in Lordaeron were all stationed at the city walls. They had no choice but to hand over the task of killing the orcs to the city guards. These city guards, who had not undergone strict military training, were good enough to deal with gangsters, but they were not enough against the elites of the Blackrock clan. The number of orcs that broke into the city was 68. These 68 orcs had caused nearly 5,000 casualties. On average, each orc had killed 2 or more city guards, and caused more than 3 or more civilian casualties. Almost every family in the Eastern District had a funeral. The citizens of Lordaeron panicked. Even though there were more than 30,000 alliance troops stationed at the back, many citizens and nobles woke up from nightmares. There was even a guy who shouted, "The orcs are coming," in his nightmare. This caused a chain reaction of panic and caused more than 100 people to trample each other. It was only until Duque asked Arthas to activate the magical lights throughout the city that the soldiers of Lordaeron sang the Lordaeron military song when they patrolled, that the citizens of Lordaeron felt a little more at ease. Just like that, the people of Lordaeron welcomed Lord Mograine's 8,000 cavalry the next day. Then 2 days later they waited for the exhausted King Tarinas to return with his main force. Even though they were forced to return, Tarinas and his infantry were welcomed back like heroes. Almost every citizen gathered at the West Gate and welcomed the return of their army with the most passionate and sincere cheers. This was not a triumphant return worth bragging about. All the people wanted was a sense of security. Tarinas was not in the mood to deal with the enthusiastic people. He hurried back to the palace. There, Deputy Commander Duque, General Lang, General Salas, General Kudrin, and Major General Haas had been waiting for a long time. Tarinas did not put on any airs as the leader of the alliance. He followed the rules of the alliance and bowed to Duque, Lang, and the other kings. Thank you very much, Deputy Commander-in-Chief, the 3 generals and our allies, for the rescue of Rotterdam City. Without your help, Lordaeron would be forever shamed. Tarinas was serious. If it wasn't for Duque, he would be a stray dog now. You're too polite, alliance leader. Didn't we establish this alliance to help each other today? If we don't work together, humans, dwarves, and elves will all be killed by the horde. We may not even be qualified to be slaves. Duque was also very polite. The kings exchanged pleasantries as well. After the necessary formalities, Tarinas did not hesitate. Alright, let me get straight to the point. Although I also think that 300,000 soldiers are needed to ensure that Rotterdam City will not be attacked by the horde, the truth is that Rotterdam City does not have enough food to sustain 300,000 soldiers and 400,000 civilians for a long period of time. In the past, Rotterdam has always been providing food, weapons, and soldiers to the various countries. Now it's Rotterdam's turn to need the support of the various countries. He spread out his palms, asking for money, rations, soldiers, everything. The leaders of the various countries felt bitter. The wild hammer dwarves almost never farmed. They lived a half-farming, half-herding life. Usually they let their griffins fly around the mountains to catch food for themselves. Salas' earthy highlands had just been plowed by the horde's locusts. If it wasn't for the fact that he didn't need cavalry to defend Torrentberg, he wouldn't have even sent out his soldiers. Alterac's home had just been raided less than a week ago, and there wasn't even a single blade of grass left. After all the twists and turns, Dalaran, which was relatively stable, was the wealthiest among all the countries. The next richest was the Stormwind Kingdom, which had been a disaster for more than a year. The summer harvest in the Hillsbrad Hills could not be hidden from anyone. Unfortunately, Stormwind had hundreds of thousands of mouths to feed. As soon as Tyrrhenas spoke, there was an awkward silence. Fortunately, everyone could remain silent except for Duque. The Alliance had been fighting with the Horde for so long, and everyone had unknowingly gotten used to Duque being the real boss. The coordination was under Duque's control. The logistics and magical fields were under Duque's control. Even the command of most of the country's military, as well as the recruitment of new members, were under Duque's control. If Lothar wasn't busy dealing with the western battlefield, everyone would have almost forgotten that Lothar was the commander-in-chief. There were also troops from Rotterdam, Gilnis, and the Dalajan. Facing the gazes of the kings, Duque's expression was calm. Who said we're going to fight a long and drawn-out battle? Why can't we be more optimistic? Now is the best time for us to wipe out the main force of the Horde. As soon as he said that, all the big shots were stunned. Their thoughts really could not keep up with Duque's pace. Weren't the Horde invincible now? Didn't they see that no one could stop the Horde's advance? The flames of war had already spread across the entire northern continent. In the eyes of the kings, there was no safe place in the entire continent. From the southernmost earthy highlands to the northernmost Long Song forest, from the westernmost South Flow coast to the easternmost hinterlands, the Horde could be seen everywhere. Even though the Alliance had the upper hand on the western battlefield, they could not do anything to the remaining 100,000 Horde. Alterac had just been destroyed, and now Duque actually said that they could wipe out the main force of the Horde? If it was the Duque from a year ago, he would probably have to face endless doubts and even ridicule at this moment. But now Duque Thlas laughed, Lang laughed, and Kudran laughed. Almost all the kings who were fighting at the eastern battlefield looked at Duque with kind eyes. Everyone was in a relaxed mood as they waited for Duque to say the answer that they had been waiting for a long time. To be honest, Tyrrhenas was very nervous just now. In order to obtain the position of the leader of the Alliance, the Rotterdam Kingdom had put in a lot of effort. However, he was not sure if his and his country's efforts would be reciprocated at this critical moment. Now, it seemed that the countries of the Alliance were not only reliable under Duque's coordination, but could also give him enough surprises. Duque smiled and opened a real-time image of a magic message. Latest news: Ghoul, Dan sold Orgrim. Chapter 441. What? Ghoul? Dan betrayed Orgrim? For most of the higher-ups in the Alliance, this was an unbelievable thing. It was as if someone had told them that Duque had betrayed Lothar. Their first reaction was that it was absurd and laughable. They were from the same faction and had always worked closely together. How could they do such a thing? But the image in front of them forced them to believe it. This is an image sent by my subordinate Darniel, who risked his life. The first thing that came into view was a huge sea and a desolate beach. Most of them were confused by this beach, but King Salas Trollbane recognized this coast. Sea-gazing cliff? Yes. Duque gave an affirmative answer. Sea-gazing cliff was the hinterlands. The sea grew larger in everyone's field of vision. Looking into the distance, they could see some ships sailing near the shore. They were as ugly as garbage ships, and everyone recognized them as the transport ships of the Horde at a glance. The ships that brought the hated tribes from the other continent to this place. Although Kurtira's and the Bloodsail Navy under Stormwind sank most of them to the bottom of the endless sea, the remaining half still brought destruction and death to the Alliance. A large group of orcs were either on the beach or in the shallow water, pulling the long oars with all their might to move the ships. An ogre sat in the middle of each ship, beating a drum that represented exertion. The orcs pulled hard with the rhythm, sending the ships into the sea. Seeing this, a general said, "Their chief is leading an army to attack Lordaeron, but they're in the hinterlands." Hee. At this point, the corners of everyone's mouths were already curving into thoughtful smiles. At this moment, a red dragon flew past. Everyone recognized it as the Red Dragon cavalry of the Horde. He rode the red dragon and circled in the air, seemingly observing the situation below. Following the direction of the red dragon, everyone saw a familiar figure on the first ship, the demigod warlock Zhou Xian. Whether the Alliance was willing to admit it or not, he was a very dangerous fellow. At least he had the record of fighting Antonidas in South Shore, and both sides suffered heavy losses. After Duque repeatedly stressed that this guy was the culprit who had conspired with Medivh to open the door of darkness and send over 1,000,000 beastmen, Duque's expression changed. Zhou Xian was even more dangerous than Great Chief Orgrim on the Alliance's list of enemies. At this moment, Duque waved his hand and Wuxia, who had been standing behind Duque, stepped forward. The Beastman Dragoon rider controlled his mount and flew to the front of the ship before shouting in Beastman language to Zhou Xian. Wuxia immediately translated, "What do you use these ships for?" The Dragoon rider continued to follow the ship with his mount while waving his free hand. Looking confused, the Warlock Monarch raised his hands in confusion. The dragon cavalry let Long Fei get closer to the ship and roared a few more times. Wuxia continued to translate, "Turn the ship around. The chief's main force is in Lordaeron, not on the other side of the sea." The dragon rider shouted again. Gul'dan was still gesturing that he could not hear. This time the beastman flew directly to the top of the ship, less than 30 meters away from the warlock. Suddenly Gul'dan's hand shot forward, and 2 green rays shot towards the dragon cavalry's chest, while the other shot towards the red dragon. Sharp pain exploded in both the beastman and the red dragon. The world around the dragon cavalry turned black in an instant. It was a huge black ball of magical energy. Clearly this ball was rapidly absorbing their lives. By the time the dragon cavalry fell from his saddle, he was already a dried corpse. The red dragon was not much better off, its huge body withering at a speed visible to the naked eye. But when it fell into the sea, it was suddenly caught by a huge net. Several huge twin-headed ogres fished up the struggling red dragon and killed it with a single blow. Then they skillfully dissected the red dragon's corpse on the deck. Clearly they had done this kind of thing many times. The video ended here. Wuxia obediently retreated behind Duque. Duque said, "This is a video from this morning. In fact, from the moment this army retreated from Kuel Salis, I had Kudrin's men follow them from afar." The Brute Hammer King nodded. A confident smile appeared on Duque's face. "To the Horde, this is definitely a rebellion. Of course, we have not received any definite information on whether Gul'dan is rebelling or not. But we can be sure that in the upcoming battle around Lordaeron, the Horde will not receive any magical support. Yes. No warlocks. No terrifying twin-headed ogre mages. There are only a bunch of muscular bastards who only know how to wield axes and clubs." Haha. That's great. I don't like those guys anymore. Finally I can kill to my heart's content. The slightly boorish Kudrin laughed loudly with the dwarf's unique loud voice. "If we can get rid of these 2 main forces of the Horde, Torrential Fortress will be saved." King Soras let out a long sigh of relief. Lang clenched his fists. In fact, he was more passionate about destroying the Horde than anyone else. The fall of Stormwind City was a pain in his heart. As long as the Horde was not destroyed, the southern continent's Stormwind City would not be able to recover. Of course, the happiest person was Tirina's. Being trapped in a siege, he was the one who suffered the most. The vast territory of Lordaeron would be cut off, and no one knew what would happen to the other areas. Tirina's was still mature and steady. "All right, I suggest that we urgently summon Chief Lothar to discuss this matter. Of course, I suggest that we strengthen the defenses of the city and wait for Chief Lothar's arrival." Duque's suggestion was naturally seen as reasonable, and was unanimously approved. After the meeting, Duque waited outside the hall for an unexpected person, the Prince of Lordaeron, Arthas. "Your Excellency Marcus, can I have a word with you?" Duque hesitated for a moment but still nodded. They sat down in a side hall, and Arthas seemed to be venting his frustrations as he told List what had happened. "On the night I abandoned the 3,000 civilians, I received a long reprimand from my father. He scolded me for not learning how to be a king. A king should put the people first. Although I think what my father said is right, I still think that my decision that day was not wrong. There is no comparison between the lives of 3,000 civilians and the lives of 300,000 people." Duque's voice was calm. "Do you love your father and sister?" "Of course," Arthas replied without hesitation. What if the enemy captures your father and sister and forces you to choose between them? No. I will never let a situation where I have to choose between the two happen. Arthas suddenly became furious. That's right. As a king you must first prevent the worst from happening. Chapter 442. But I can't avoid it. Arthas clenched her fists tightly. That fellow Ichina's claims to be the regent, but he wants me to make decisions at crucial moments. There are many things I don't know. By the time I find out, I already have to choose the lesser of two terrible decisions. I don't understand. In essence, what's the difference between me and you, the commander, when making decisions? The surroundings immediately fell silent. Even though this side hall was empty, who knew if someone was eavesdropping next door? No, it should be said that Duque was certain that someone was eavesdropping. He didn't even need the system notification to hear the heavy breathing. Duque didn't know who it was. Duque only knew that he had to be careful with his words. Duke rested his chin on his hand. Can I ask you a question that is a little cruel? Go ahead. Arthas made an inviting gesture. You're drifting on the sea with a ship full of refugees with no hope of rescue. Suddenly, you discover that a third of them are infected. What will you do? Arthas revealed a pained expression. I'll have that third jump into the sea. Quarantine and then leave the infected to fend for themselves. This was the most common way to deal with a plague in this era. Duque didn't comment. What if you discover that the remaining half are infected as well? Have them jump into the sea as well. Arthas's voice had already become softer. After a while you'll discover that half of the remaining people... Enough. You're interrogating my conscience and soul. Arthas's eyes were bloodshot as she slammed the table and stood up. No, I'm not interrogating your conscience and soul. Duque looked at Arthas coldly. I'm just telling you, don't use your shallow common sense to judge every problem and force yourself into a dead end. The biggest difference between you and the commander is that you consider problems comprehensively. Comprehensive? Yes. I was just asking you what to do. I'm not forcing you to deal with things according to the rules of this era. Arthas was stunned. Then what to do? Duque's voice became stern. Have you learned any medical knowledge? Have you asked if there are any doctors among the refugees? Is there a priest? Have you confirmed the type of plague? Is there any hope of a cure? Arthas was bombarded by 5 consecutive questions and he tried to defend himself. But I don't have any common sense at all. That's why I asked you to find out if there are any doctors among the refugees. As the commander-in-chief, it doesn't matter if you don't understand. You can just leave it to the experts. You need to appoint someone who looks like the most reliable person to be your advisor. If you don't know how to choose, then let the people in that area choose one themselves. If you can't make a judgment, then let the experts do it for you. Arthas was shocked at first, but after the shock she felt a kind of heartfelt admiration. It turned out that there was a reason why Duke Marcus, the deputy commander-in-chief of the Alliance and the Horde, who had won so many great battles, was successful. Was this the difference between him and a top commander? That's right. After receiving the warning from the deputy commander, since the regent minister was incompetent, he should shoulder the responsibility and arrange things as comprehensively as possible instead of doing nothing and waiting for the situation to deteriorate before making a painful choice. Arthas lowered his head and bowed deeply to Duke. I've learned a lot. Sir Marcus, I only have one last question. Arthas asked solemnly, what if, in the end, I have no one to rely on and no common sense in this area, and I have to make my own choice? You will avoid the worst situation and at the same time increase your options. The lack of a better choice itself proves that your vision is too narrow. If your wisdom and insight are not enough to create some better choices for you, then choose the choice that you feel the most guilty about. If you really try your best, your heart will feel better, at least you can comfort yourself. Comfort myself? Arthas was a little dazed and her whole body was dizzy. As if she was sleepwalking, she thanked Duque again and then left. Duque watched Arthas, who was supposed to become the Lich King in history, leave like this. Duque also sighed. He also felt that it was a pity for the fall of the historical Arthas. This could not be blamed on the historical Arthas. This itself was the plot of the most despicable and shameless demon, the most proficient in human nature. Duque did not know if he could reverse the future of Arthas's fall. Perhaps he could change the tragic fate of death like Lang, the Van Cleef father and daughter Lillis and the others. Perhaps he could not, but at least he tried. Instead of regretting doing nothing, it is better to regret after doing it. Duque seemed to be talking to himself in a self-deprecating manner. Yes, well said. A crisp female voice suddenly reached Duque's ears. Duque instinctively felt that the voice was a bit familiar. The next second he found out who the owner of the voice was, Princess Kalia Menethil. Duque was dumbfounded. Your Highness. The girl in a pure white low-cut dress stood alone at the door of the side hall. Looking at the girl who seemed to be suppressing her excitement and crossing her fingers in front of her chest, Duque suddenly felt a sense of purity. He did not know if there was a slight sigh in his breath. Obviously at this moment, all the noise disappeared because of the girl's focus. Any other elements would be reduced to impure things. The pure, focused and even a little fanatical light in the girl's eyes was overwhelming. It almost turned into a physical love, like a prayer that went straight to the heart. Duque almost instantly felt the adoration from the girl's eyes. Chapter 443. When Duke said, "This is what I should do," the girl was in a state of confusion. The girl's mouth opened and closed slightly, shouting silently, "Duque, I've been." The girl's heart was like a willow branch swaying in the wind, wavering. The thumping of her heart could be heard clearly, shaking her eardrums and chest. Her chest was so uncomfortable, that overflowing feeling was like a volcano was about to erupt in her chest, as if it was going to tear her heart apart and break out in the next moment. The air had become dry and her mouth was half opened like a machine with a locked angle, unable to open any wider. The slightly warm air invaded her lungs and when she exhaled, it made her entire trachea and mouth feel like it was on fire. She was embarrassed, but her rationality was frantically urging her to take action. Duke Marcus was the most outstanding young man of this generation in the Alliance of the 10 Nations, the greatest hero. There was no one else like him. He was busy, glorious, and the hope of all mankind. If she gave up this chance to confess, she might not be able to wait for another chance. Countless voices rushed into Kalia's mind. Say it. Kalia, muster up your courage. Kalia, aren't you determined to be like those young girls courageously pursuing their love in novels and grasp your own happiness? He is the Duke of the Southern Continent, and once the war ends he will return to the Southern Continent. Father, who always wants to obtain more territory for Lord Darren, will not allow you to marry far away. Although she had the most glorious background in the entire continent, she was very clear that this princess identity that all women were envious of was not valued by Duque. There was no deliberate flattery, no fear of keeping a respectful distance, only a kind of calmness. Neither servile nor overbearing, but a gaze that made people feel extremely comfortable. This was what she wanted. This kind of young hero was what she had been chasing after in her dreams countless times. She shouted in her heart again, "Take action, Kalia." Her rationality was driving her to take action, and then, Kalia mustered up every drop of courage in her body, and what she thought was a shout was actually the volume of her voice. Can you let me be your follower? Oh my God. What nonsense did I say? I should have said, are you willing to go out with me? But how shameful. I can't say something like that. Woo-woo. Kalia cried. The young girl cried bitterly in her heart. Especially after seeing Duque's stupefied expression, the girl was so ashamed that she wanted to die. What did I say? Gritting his teeth, he squeezed out the last drop of courage in his body. I want to travel the world with you. But something didn't seem right. Wouldn't that become a standard follower's speech? I just need to say that I like him normally. Woo-woo. But Duque was keenly aware of Princess Kalia's intentions. As a veteran player who had transmigrated on the eve of version 6.0, Duque did not know that Princess Kalia would become the most popular follower of the priest temple in the later timeline. This did not prevent Duque from having a better impression of Princess Kalia. Duque stared at Princess Kalia. Her golden waterfall-like hair was tied into a unique bun at the back of her head, revealing her slender ivory-white neck. There was a faint blush on her cheeks, and her serious and anxious expression made people feel as if they were in a dream. At this moment, Princess Kalia showed her most girlish side. The kind of pure beauty that made all men's hearts palpitate with excitement and could not help but want to protect her. In addition, she exuded a noble and extraordinary temperament with every movement she made. This was a fatal temptation to any normal man. Phew. After a short moment of confusion, Duque's brain worked at high speed. In terms of feelings and senses, it would undoubtedly be more than enough to satisfy any man's vanity if he managed to woo the renowned elder sister of Arthes, a genuine and noble princess of noble lineage. Think about it, if this Lich King Arthas, who had once been the Prince of Lordaeron in history, had defeated more than 17 heroes, including 3 kings and a blue dragon, and made the whole continent and even the world of Azeroth tremble, he would have no choice but to call Duque brother-in-law. Oh. That kind of sourness just thinking about it would make one feel high. Unfortunately, reason told Duque that this was courting death. Just as Duque could not touch Arthas now, Duque could not touch Princess Kalia either. If the wheel of history could not be stopped, then the ending of World War II at the Dark Portal was almost a foregone conclusion, then World War III was inevitable. According to the original history, all investments in Lordaeron were destined to be reduced to nothing under the fierce attack of the Calamity Army. If 1 million gold was exchanged for coins and thrown into the sea, it would at least cause a huge splash. However, investing in Lordaeron in any form was destined to fail. It was not the kind that would fail from the end of the street, but directly to the center of the earth. Thinking of this, Duque made a decision. The princess would accept it, but he would not let Lordaeron get a single cent. Duque shamelessly used the moral integrity of a Mediv. At this moment, Duque was possessed by a saint. Unknowingly, he had the purest temperament and the greatest sentiment. Duque's gentle smile, those eyes that seemed to be able to suck in one's heart, and that magnetic voice intoxicated the inexperienced Princess Kalia. There are as many people who wish to become my follower as there are stars in the sky. Kalia, what do you know? Princess Kalia was sensitive to the fact that Duque did not use words that made her uncomfortable like princess or highness, but called her by her name more intimately. It was clearly a very common thing in people's daily lives, but it made Kalia ecstatic. Can I call you Duque? Duque nodded with a smile. I'm actually an intermediate commandment priest. After saying that, Kalia showed Duque her holy light. It was indeed extremely pure holy light, and her cultivation was not low. Duque was dumbfounded. Duque had taken in many subordinates. There were a few future marshals and heroes. There were some who could fight, some who could eavesdrop, some who could lead troops, and some who could take charge. However, there was really no pure healing profession. A priest who specialized in healing was a big healer. Big healer. Do you understand? A group of old men fighting bloody battles at the front and almost dying from serious injuries. To revive them, they often relied on the most crucial mouthful of milk. Oh no, greater healing skill. At this moment, Duque was even more determined to abduct Princess Kalia. You're tuning in to the Zhou Xian's Legacy YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.